Imagine standing in a chamber sealed for 4,000 years. The air hasn't moved. The walls hold markings no living person has ever explained. And the bones on the floor don't belong to any human species we've officially cataloged. This isn't fiction. This is archaeology, the real, documented kind, where the deeper scientists dig, the more uncomfortable the answers become. Structures that shouldn't exist. Calendars tracking events no civilization should have known about. Mass graves with no visible cause. Welcome. Let's begin. Somewhere in the dense, almost impenetrable jungle of southeastern Ecuador, where the Andes begin their long descent toward the Amazon basin, the earth opens up. Not dramatically, not with fanfare. Just a narrow shaft in the ground, easy to miss, easy to walk past, unless you know what you're looking for. Local Shuar people have known about it for generations. They call it Cueva de los Tallos, the Cave of the Oilbirds, named for the nocturnal creatures that nest in its upper chambers, filling the darkness with an eerie, disorienting echo. To descend into it, you don't walk. You are lowered, rope and harness straight down into blackness, until your feet find ancient stone and your eyes slowly adjust to a world that feels entirely disconnected from the one above. What waits below is extraordinary even by purely geological standards. A vast subterranean network of tunnels and chambers, some with ceilings so perfectly flat, so unnervingly level, that early visitors struggled to accept they were natural formations. The walls in places appear almost dressed, smoothed, arranged. Geologists have offered explanations rooted in water erosion and volcanic activity, and those explanations are scientifically credible. But they haven't fully quieted the questions. The cave entered wider public consciousness in 1976, when a Scottish explorer named Stan Hall organized one of the largest cave expeditions in history. Remarkably, he convinced Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon, to serve as honorary president of the mission. Armstrong himself descended into the cave. What drew a man who had stood on the lunar surface to a hole in the Ecuadorian jungle? The answer traces back to a Hungarian-Argentine author named Janos Juan Moric, who in the late 1960s claimed to have discovered something staggering inside. A vast underground library, not scrolls or clay tablets, but thousands of metal plaques, allegedly inscribed with the accumulated knowledge of a lost civilization. He called it the Metal Library. He described walls lined with sculpted animals, a throne made of an unidentified material, and human and animal remains that defied easy categorization. Moric was a polarizing figure, passionate, grandiose, and difficult to verify. He signed a legal document in Ecuador in 1969, formally claiming the discovery. Yet the objects he described were never independently confirmed. No photograph, no artifact, no third-party witness who could corroborate the full account. And yet, the 1976 expedition found something. Not the metal library, but anomalies. Passages that seemed deliberately shaped. Chambers that opened into one another with a geometry that felt, to some participants, less like accident and more like intention. The team included professional archaeologists, and their reports were careful and measured. They did not confirm Moric's claims, but neither did they dismiss the site as ordinary. The Shuar people, whose ancestors have lived alongside this cave for centuries, have always treated it as sacred. Their oral traditions speak of it not merely as a geological feature but as a threshold, a place between worlds, between the living and something older. They did not need European explorers to tell them the cave was significant. They already knew. What's striking is how many independent threads lead to the same place. Indigenous oral tradition. A legal claim filed in a South American court. A moonwalker rappelling into the dark. Geologists quietly noting irregularities they can describe but not entirely explain. The cave has been partially surveyed, mapped, studied, and still, large sections remain unexplored, passages that branch off into directions no modern team has fully followed, which raises the question that seems to hang in the air of every chamber, every tunnel, every pocket of absolute silence down there. What was someone, or something, trying to preserve? We travel now from the darkness beneath Ecuador's jungle floor to something equally unsettling, but older. Much older. And this time, the mystery isn't buried underground. It's sitting in plain sight, staring back at us. In the dry, dusty plains of northeastern Syria, where the land stretches flat in every direction and the horizon seems to go on forever, there is a place called Tel Brak. A tell, in archaeological terms, is simply a mound. Layers of human settlement compressed over thousands of years into a single raised hill. People lived here, built here, died here, and were buried here, century after century, until the earth itself rose around them. Tel Brak is one of the oldest urban sites ever discovered. Excavations have revealed continuous human occupation stretching back more than 6,000 years. That alone makes it remarkable. But it isn't why we're here. We're here because of what was found near the summit of that ancient mound, a structure so unusual, so singular in its purpose, that archaeologists are still debating what it truly meant to the people who built it. They call it the Eye Temple. It was constructed sometime around 3500 BC, during a period when the first true cities were beginning to emerge in the ancient Near East. The people of this era were not primitive. They were organized, sophisticated, and already developing the earliest forms of writing, administration, and long-distance trade. They built with intention. Nothing about the Eye Temple appears accidental. The structure itself is not enormous by later standards, but what was found inside stopped excavators cold. Thousands of small alabaster figurines, hundreds upon hundreds of them, packed into the temple deposits, varying in size but identical in one haunting detail. Each one bears a pair of oversized, staring eyes. Some are simple, almost abstract, a flat disc with two carved circles. Others are more elaborate, with multiple pairs of eyes stacked vertically on a single figure, as if seeing in several directions at once. A few appear to represent a large figure holding a smaller one, an adult and child perhaps, rendered entirely in eyes, no mouths, no hands, no feet, just eyes. Archaeologists named them eye idols, and they have been found not only at Tel Brak, but at sites scattered across a wide region, suggesting these objects traveled, or that the idea behind them spread deliberately from one community to another. Some were found in what appear to be offering deposits. Others were positioned in ways that suggest they were meant to be seen, displayed, or presented before something. The mainstream interpretation is considered and reasonable. These were votive offerings. Objects brought to a temple by worshippers seeking divine attention or favor. The eyes in this reading represent the act of watching, a deity's gaze, ever-present and all-seeing. The worshipper brings an idol that sees on their behalf, leaving their proxy in the temple even after they have gone home. It's a coherent explanation, and it fits what we know about religious practice in the ancient Near East, where temples functioned as houses of the divine, and offerings were the currency of devotion. But it doesn't answer everything. Why eyes specifically, and only eyes? Other ancient cultures represented their gods with full human or animal forms. The people of Tel Brak were capable of detailed craftsmanship. They could have carved complete figures. They chose not to. They returned again and again, across multiple generations of temple use, to this single image. The unblinking, staring, endlessly watching eye. What were they afraid of missing? Or, perhaps more precisely, What were they afraid of being missed by? There is another layer to this that researchers have noted with quiet unease. The sheer volume of eye idols found at Tel Brak is difficult to explain purely through ordinary religious practice. We are not talking about dozens of objects. Thousands were deposited here. That requires not just devotion but organization, production at scale, coordination, possibly centralized manufacture and distribution. Someone was making these in large quantities. Someone was ensuring they reached the temple. That implies a system, a belief structure powerful enough to sustain industrial-level production of a single religious symbol across what may have been centuries of continuous use. What was that belief? What did those eyes represent to the people who carved them, carried them, and left them in the dark of that ancient chamber? Some researchers have noted the timing. The Eye Temple at Tel Brak was built and used during the same broad period when the world's earliest known writing was emerging, first in Mesopotamia, then spreading outward. This was a moment of profound cognitive and social transformation, when human beings were developing new ways to record, transmit, and preserve information across time and distance. Some scholars have wondered whether the obsession with eyes during this period reflects something deeper than worship, a cultural preoccupation with observation itself, with being seen, recorded, known. Others have pointed to the geometric precision of some eye idols, noting that their proportions follow patterns that appear intentional rather than decorative. Whether this means anything beyond skilled craftsmanship is genuinely unclear, but it has led a smaller group of researchers to ask whether these objects served a secondary function, as counting tools, as markers of social status, or as something else entirely that we no longer have the cultural vocabulary to recognize. The temple was rebuilt at least 3 times on the same spot. Each rebuilding buried the previous structure beneath a new foundation, preserving what came before rather than discarding it. That is not the behavior of people who considered these objects disposable. That is the behavior of people who considered them worth protecting. Tel Brak was excavated by British archaeologist Max Mallowan in the 1930s, the same Max Mallowan who was married to Agatha Christie, who accompanied him on several digs and walked these same dusty grounds. She once wrote that the site felt ancient in a way that went beyond measurement. It is difficult, standing before a case of eye idols in a museum today, not to understand exactly what she meant. Thousands of pairs of eyes, all of them staring forward, all of them silent. And the question they seem to ask, the one carved into every flat alabaster face, is the same one we are still trying to answer. What exactly were they watching for? Those alabaster eyes from Tel Brak stay with you. There is something about a gaze with no face behind it, no expression, no context, no softness that lodges itself in the mind long after you've looked away. But if Tel Brak leaves us asking what those ancient people were watching for, our next mystery asks something slightly different, and in some ways more personal. It asks, who were they watching? We move now to the city of Ammon in modern-day Jordan. Not to the city as it exists today, sprawling modern, alive with traffic and light, but to what lies beneath it. Because Amman is built on top of something far older than itself. The ancient site known as Ain Ghazal, which translates simply as Spring of the Gazelles, sits partially buried beneath a highway interchange on the city's outskirts. Most drivers pass over it without a second thought. Few realize they are crossing one of the most significant Neolithic sites ever discovered. The settlement at Ain Ghazal was occupied from approximately 7250 BC to around 5000 BC. At its peak, it may have housed up to 3,000 people, making it one of the largest known communities in the ancient Near East during that period. These were not nomads. They were farmers, herders, builders. They constructed 2-story limestone structures, They plastered their floors and walls. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their homes, sometimes removing the skulls afterward and preserving them separately, a practice found across several Neolithic sites in the region, and one that still provokes more questions than answers. But none of that is why we're here. In 1983, during construction work on a road, a bulldozer blade struck something in the earth and exposed a pit. Inside that pit, archaeologists discovered something that stopped the excavation entirely and drew specialists from around the world. Buried carefully, deliberately, in two separate caches, the first in 1983, the second discovered nearby in 1985, were 32 statues and busts. Human figures constructed from a core of bundled reeds and twine, coated in white lime plaster, then sculpted into form. They ranged from under half a meter to nearly a meter tall. Some were full figures, others were busts, torso and head only. Several depicted what appear to be two-headed figures, though researchers debate whether these represent conjoined individuals, a deliberate artistic choice, or something with deeper symbolic meaning. What makes them genuinely extraordinary? What makes them feel, even in photographs, like something more than archaeology, are the eyes. Painted in bitumen, bold and wide, with irises that catch light in an unsettling way, the eyes of the Ain Ghazal statues are alert, present. They do not look like decorative objects. They look like they are looking at you. Several have a slight forward tilt to the head, a posture that reads, in an almost uncomfortably modern way, as attentiveness, as if they were made not just to be seen, but to see. They are the oldest large-scale statues of the human form ever found, nearly 9,000 years old. Nothing else like them exists from this period. They predate the famous Neolithic carvings of Europe, predate the earliest Egyptian sculpture by thousands of years. They emerged, fully formed in ambition and execution, from a culture we are only beginning to understand. The mainstream interpretation is that these figures held ritual or ceremonial significance, possibly connected to ancestor veneration, the same impulse that led Ain Ghazal's residents to preserve the skulls of their dead. In this reading, the statues may represent founding ancestors, protective spirits, or figures of communal religious importance. The fact that they were buried, carefully, deliberately, in organized caches rather than discarded, suggests they were not simply destroyed when their usefulness ended. They were interred, put to rest, almost, with a kind of intention that implies they were once considered alive in some meaningful sense. That is a significant thing to sit with. The people of Ain Ghazal may have believed these figures possessed something, presence, power, or memory, that required respectful disposal rather than abandonment. But other questions remain open. The two-headed figures in particular resist easy explanation. Were they representing a specific myth or cosmology? A divine pairing? Something about the relationship between the living and the dead? Between this world and whatever these people believed lay beyond it? No written record exists from this period. No text survives to tell us what these figures meant to the hands that shaped them. There is also the question of the cache itself. Both deposits were organized, figures arranged together, some wrapped or bundled before burial. This was not a hasty concealment. It was a ceremony. Something happened at Ain Ghazal that caused these figures to be gathered, prepared, and placed in the earth at a specific moment in the settlement's history. What that event was, a religious transformation, a community crisis, the end of a particular ritual tradition, remains unknown. Some researchers have noted that the period of the figure's burial coincides roughly with signs of environmental stress at the site, evidence of overgrazing, soil depletion, possibly the early stages of the community's eventual decline. Whether the burial of the statues was connected to this stress, a ritual response to hardship, a farewell to something that was ending, is speculative but not unreasonable. What is certain is that whoever buried them expected them to stay buried. They were not meant to be found. They were not left as a message or a monument. They were placed in the earth with care, covered over, and released. And then a bulldozer found them 9,000 years later, blinking in the Jordanian sunlight. They now rest in the Jordan Archaeological Museum in Amman, cleaned, stabilized, and displayed behind glass. Visitors stand before them and often fall quiet. There is something about those wide, painted eyes that resists casual observation. They were made by people who had no writing, no metal, no wheel, and yet they understood something about the human face, about presence and gaze, and the desire to be remembered that still reaches across 9,000 years and lands somewhere in the chest. What else did they understand that we haven't yet thought to ask? Those 9,000-year-old eyes stay with you, wide, painted, expectant. The Ain Ghazal statues were built to hold something. Memory, perhaps, or presence, or the weight of a belief system we can no longer fully read. But as unsettling as they are, there is a stillness to them, a quietness. What comes next is not quiet. We leave the ancient Near East and travel west, far west, to the Pacific coast of South America. To a stretch of Ecuadorian shoreline where the ocean is loud, the air is thick with salt and humidity, and the ground, it turns out, holds something that archaeologists were entirely unprepared to find. The small coastal town of Salango sits in the Manabí province of Ecuador, where fishing boats still go out each morning the way they have for centuries. It is not a place that appears in many travel guides. It does not have the name recognition of Machu Picchu or the Galapagos. But in 1987, during construction work near the town, excavators uncovered a burial site that would quietly become one of the most disturbing and enigmatic archaeological discoveries in South American history. What they found was not simply a cemetery. It was something far more deliberate, far more structured, and far more difficult to explain. The site contained multiple human burials, which was not unusual for the region. What was unusual was what had been done to some of the bodies before interment. Several individuals had been buried wearing the remains of other people, not as grave goods or symbolic objects, but physically incorporated. Skulls placed over skulls. Jawbones fitted onto faces. In at least one case, an individual appeared to have been interred inside the remains of another, larger person, encased, almost, in a second skeleton. Archaeologists described these as burial within a burial, and the phrase, clinical as it is, does nothing to diminish the strangeness of the image. The site is associated with the Guangala and Bahia cultures, pre-Columbian peoples who inhabited coastal Ecuador roughly between 100 BC and 800 AD. These were not isolated or unsophisticated communities. They were maritime traders with established networks running up and down the Pacific coast, exchanging goods, ideas, and almost certainly beliefs across considerable distances. They produced detailed ceramic figurines, worked with metal, and demonstrated a clear understanding of astronomy and seasonal cycles. They were, in other words, people with a fully developed inner life, a cosmology, a set of rituals, a way of making meaning in the world. And somewhere inside that cosmology, this practice made sense. The mainstream interpretation among researchers is that what we are seeing at Salango represents a form of ritual transformation, a ceremony in which the dead were deliberately merged, one identity layered over another, as part of a belief about what happens after death. In several pre-Columbian traditions across the Americas, the boundary between the living and the dead was understood very differently than in Western frameworks. The dead did not simply depart. They remained present, active, capable of influence. Ancestor veneration was not metaphorical, it was practical. The dead were consulted, appeased, incorporated into the ongoing life of the community. In this reading, the layered burials at Salango may represent something like a deliberate merging of identities, perhaps a ritual in which the power, status, or spiritual essence of one individual was transferred to another through physical union in death. The person wearing the other person's remains was not simply buried with them. They were, in some sense, becoming them. It is a coherent framework, and it aligns with practices documented, though rarely so literally, elsewhere in the pre-Columbian world. But it leaves questions that the framework doesn't fully absorb. Who decided which individuals underwent this process? Was it a mark of honor or something else entirely? The skeletal analysis conducted at Salango revealed that some of the individuals involved showed signs of violent death, though researchers have been careful to note that this does not necessarily indicate sacrifice, as trauma to bone can occur in many contexts. Still, the possibility sits there, unresolved, in the margins of the official record. There is also the question of the site's organization. This was not a random collection of burials. The positioning of bodies, the deliberate placement of one set of remains over or within another, suggests choreography. Someone, or a group of people, knew exactly what they were doing and why. The ritual had rules. It had meaning that was understood by those performing it, even if that meaning has not survived in any form we can read. Some researchers have noted that the Salango site shows evidence of repeated use over an extended period, meaning this was not a single event, not one unusual burial that might be explained as an anomaly. This happened more than once, possibly many times. It was, in some sense, a tradition. What tradition? What belief system, sustained across generations, produced this particular expression of what it means to honor, or transform, or contain the dead? The ceramics recovered from the site offer partial glimpses, figures with elaborate headdresses, forms that blend human and animal features, imagery that suggests a worldview in which categories we treat as fixed, living and dead, human and spirit, self and other, were understood as fluid, permeable, subject to ritual manipulation. It is a profoundly different way of understanding the world. And Salango is one of the places where we can see it, not in texts or carvings, but in the earth itself, in the literal, physical arrangement of human remains that someone once considered sacred. The site is now partially preserved, and ongoing research continues to refine our understanding of the cultures involved. But the core of what was found there has not become less strange with time or study. Two people, merged in death, placed in the ground by hands that understood exactly what they were doing, following rules we have lost, serving a purpose we can only guess at. What did it mean to become someone else in the moment of burial? And what did those left above the ground believe would happen next? The burials at Salango stay with the mind in a particular way, not because of what was found, but because of what it implies. That somewhere, in a community of living people, a decision was made. A ritual was planned, and the dead were arranged, with care and intention, into something new. Whatever that meant to them, it meant something. It was not random, it was not careless, but at least at Salango, the bodies were whole. What we encounter next removes even that comfort. We travel now to Bavaria, in southern Germany, a landscape of rolling hills, dense forest, and quiet agricultural land. It is the kind of place that feels settled, old in a comfortable way, layered with centuries of ordinary human life. But the land here holds older things than comfort. Much older. Near the town of Nördlingen, in a shallow cave system known as the Ofnet Caves, Something was discovered in 1908 that researchers are still struggling to fully explain more than a century later. Two bowl-shaped hollows in the cave floor, natural depressions in the rock, each roughly the size of a large cooking vessel. And inside each hollow, arranged with evident deliberateness, were human heads. Not skulls in the archaeological sense, not the bleached ancient remains that come to mind when we think of prehistoric bone. At the time of deposition, these were relatively fresh. The heads had been severed from their bodies, treated with red ochre, and placed facing west, all of them consistently oriented in the same direction. Nestled together like objects stored for safekeeping, surrounded by grave goods, pierced deer teeth, shells, the kind of carefully made ornaments that in other contexts we associate with honored burial. There were 34 heads in total across both hollows, men, women, and children. The youngest were infants, the oldest were middle-aged adults. They represent, by the best estimates of physical anthropology, multiple family groups, people who were related to one another, who lived and died together. They date to approximately 6500 BC, placing them in the Mesolithic period, a time when Europe was inhabited by hunter-gatherer communities in transition. The Ice Age recently ended, the world slowly warming and reshaping itself around its human inhabitants. The mainstream interpretation has shifted over the decades as analytical techniques have improved. Early researchers assumed this was evidence of trophy-taking, heads collected from enemies as prizes of war or dominance. That reading felt intuitive, perhaps because it fit a certain narrative about prehistoric violence. But closer analysis complicated the picture considerably. The care evident in the deposition is difficult to reconcile with a simple trophy interpretation. Red ochre, a pigment used across many prehistoric cultures in burial contexts, was applied deliberately. The orientation of all heads facing west was consistent and intentional. The grave goods, modest but present, suggest these individuals were not dishonored. They were, in some sense, tended to. More recent forensic analysis has added another layer. Many of the skulls show evidence of perimortem trauma, blows to the head, injuries consistent with violent death. But the pattern of that trauma and the demographic spread of the victims has led some researchers toward a difficult conclusion. This may not be a trophy cache from multiple raids over time. It may be the remains of a single catastrophic event. A massacre, possibly, in which an entire community, men, women, children, infants, was killed at once. And then, by someone, their heads were gathered and interred here with apparent reverence, which raises a question that forensic analysis alone cannot answer. Who performed the burial? If this was a massacre carried out by outsiders, why would the perpetrators then arrange the heads with such care, face them west, surround them with ornaments? And if it was carried out by members of the same community, or a related one, what kind of event, what kind of belief system could produce both the killing and the careful, almost tender interment that followed? Some researchers have proposed that the Ofnet deposits reflect a form of ritual killing, followed by ancestral veneration, a practice in which the head, specifically, was understood to be the seat of identity, memory, or spirit. Across many cultures and time periods, the head has held particular symbolic weight. To preserve it, even after violent death, might have been understood as preserving something essential about the person. Not disposing of them, containing them. Others have pointed to the demographic profile of the remains as evidence of intergroup violence, a raid or conflict in which an entire family unit was wiped out, their heads taken not as trophies but as a form of spiritual appropriation, absorbing the identity or power of the defeated into the victor's community. Neither explanation is fully satisfying. Neither resolves the tension at the heart of what was found in those two shallow hollows, that someone killed these people, and someone, perhaps the same people, perhaps others, treated their remains with what looks, unmistakably, like reverence. The Ofnet Caves are not a well-known site. They do not appear in popular histories of prehistory. They do not draw visitors or generate documentary series the way more visually dramatic discoveries do. But among researchers who study prehistoric violence and mortuary practice, they occupy a quiet, persistent place. A site that refuses to be neatly categorized, that sits at the intersection of brutality and ceremony in a way that resists resolution. 34 heads, facing west, surrounded by the careful tokens of a culture that clearly had strong beliefs about what the dead deserved. What those beliefs were, what worldview could hold both the killing and the tenderness, the violence and the ochre, remains one of the most unsettling open questions in European prehistory. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: whoever arranged those heads in the earth knew exactly what they were doing. They had done it before, or had been taught how. This was not improvisation, it was tradition. The word that lingers after Ofnet is tradition, not accident, not desperation. Tradition, meaning repetition, meaning teaching, meaning a community that passed this practice from one generation to the next and considered it, in some framework we can no longer access, entirely normal. That word becomes even heavier when we arrive at our next site. Because what happened at Ofnet, disturbing as it is, was contained. 34 individuals. 2 hollows, a discrete bounded event, or series of events, in a small cave in southern Germany. What happened at Domuztepe was not contained, it was not small, and the people who carried it out were not hunter-gatherers on the edge of survival. They were settled, sophisticated, and by the standards of their time, extraordinarily accomplished. We travel now to southeastern Turkey, to the broad, fertile plains of the upper Euphrates region, where agriculture had been established for thousands of years, and where by around 5500 BC, communities had grown into something approaching towns. The site is called Domuztepe, a name that translates plainly as Pig Hill. It is a tell, like Tel Brak, built up over centuries of continuous occupation into a mound that rises above the surrounding landscape. Excavations led by archaeologists from the University of Manchester and UCLA, beginning in the 1990s, revealed a settlement of considerable size and complexity, evidence of long-distance trade, sophisticated pottery, organized food storage, and a community that had clearly mastered the fundamentals of settled life. And then, toward the edge of the settlement, they found the pit. It is referred to in the archaeological literature as the Death Pit, a term that is clinical in phrasing but does nothing to soften what it describes. A large, roughly circular deposit, deliberately dug, filled with the remains of at least 40 individuals, men, women, and children, along with animal bones, pottery, and ash. The human remains were not intact burials. They were fragmented, disarticulated, and in many cases showed clear evidence of processing. That word, processing, is the one researchers use. It is chosen carefully. What it means when the evidence is examined directly is this: the bones had been defleshed. Cut marks consistent with the removal of muscle and tissue were found on multiple individuals. Some bones had been burned. Others had been cracked in ways consistent with the extraction of marrow. The remains had been, in the language of the analysis, treated in ways that are difficult to distinguish from the treatment of animal remains found at the same site. The bones of cattle and other livestock that had clearly been butchered for consumption. The excavators did not use the word lightly, neither will we. The evidence at Domuztepe is considered by many researchers to be among the strongest archaeological cases for cannibalism in the prehistoric Near East. But, And this is the part that makes Domuztepe genuinely difficult to categorize. It does not appear to have been survival cannibalism. These were not people driven to extremity by famine or isolation. Domuztepe was a prosperous settlement. The death pit itself contained feasting debris, the remains of large communal meals, ceramics consistent with food service and consumption at scale. Whatever happened here happened in the context of abundance, not desperation. It happened, the evidence suggests, as a ritual. The mainstream interpretation among the researchers who have studied the site most closely is that the death pit represents the remains of a large-scale mortuary feast, a communal ceremony in which the dead, or some of the dead, were consumed as part of a belief system in which ingesting the deceased was understood as a form of honor, continuation, or spiritual incorporation. This practice, known as endocannibalism, has been documented ethnographically in various cultures across human history, and it operates within a coherent cosmological logic. By consuming the dead, the community absorbs them. They do not disappear, they persist, distributed among the living. In this reading, the death pit is not a crime scene. It is a sacred space, the physical remnant of a ceremony that the people of Domuztepe considered not just acceptable but necessary. That framework is important to hold, and yet it does not resolve every question the pit raises. The demographic spread of the remains, adults and children, multiple individuals, processed together, has led some researchers to ask whether all participants in this ceremony were willing, or whether the category of the dead was, in some cases, created specifically for the purpose of the ritual. The evidence does not answer this directly. Perimortem trauma is present on some remains, but distinguishing between injuries sustained in life, at the moment of death, or during postmortem processing is technically and interpretively complex. What is clear is the scale. 40 individuals, minimum. A large organized pit. Evidence of communal feasting surrounding it. This was not a marginal practice conducted in secret. It was, by all appearances, a community event, something that required planning, coordination, and the participation of many hands. Someone led it. Someone knew the sequence of acts required. Someone understood what it meant. The pottery recovered from the death pit is particularly striking. Large, well-made vessels, some decorated, some plain, all consistent with serving and consuming food in quantity. These were not improvised containers. They were brought to this place for this purpose. The feast had been prepared. Domuztepe continued to be occupied for centuries after the death pit was sealed. Life went on above it, trading, farming, building, all the ordinary textures of settled existence. The pit was covered, incorporated into the landscape of the tell, and eventually forgotten, until excavation brought it back. It sits now in the archaeological record as one of the most complete and carefully documented examples of ritual feasting behavior in the prehistoric world. Studied, published, discussed in academic journals with measured, precise language. And yet, the measured language cannot quite contain what the evidence describes. A community that gathered, prepared, consumed, and then buried its dead together, and considered this, in whatever framework governed their inner lives, an act of devotion. What did they believe happened to a person after that? Where did they think the dead went? And did they believe they were sending them there or keeping them close? Domuztepe leaves us with a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of something that has been deliberately covered over, sealed beneath centuries of ordinary life, as if the community that came after understood, on some level, that what lay beneath required containment. It is a pattern we keep encountering. The buried cache, the sealed pit, the thing placed carefully in the earth and left there. But not everything ancient and unexplained was hidden. some things were built to be seen, built at enormous scale, in open landscape, under open sky, and those structures raise a different kind of question. Not what were they hiding, but what were they reaching for? We move now to the Golan Heights, a wide, wind-swept plateau in the southern Levant, where the land is basalt dark and treeless, and the sky seems larger than it does elsewhere. It is a landscape that feels exposed, almost uncomfortably so, as if there is nowhere to stand that is not fully visible from above. And in that landscape, rising from the plateau in a series of concentric rings, is one of the most enigmatic megalithic monuments in the world. It is called Rujm el-Hiri, an Arabic name meaning stone heap of the wild cat. In Hebrew, it is known as Gilgal Rephaim, the wheel of the giants. Both names gesture at something in the structure's character, its size, its strangeness, the sense that it belongs to a scale of effort beyond ordinary human motivation. From the ground, it is difficult to read. The walls of basalt stone rise to shoulder height in places, forming rings that seem to curve away in every direction without obvious beginning or end. It is only from above, from the air, or from satellite imagery, that the full shape becomes legible. 5 concentric circles of stone, the outermost stretching nearly 160 meters in diameter, with a central cairn at the hub that stands several meters tall. The total volume of stone used in its construction is estimated at around 40,000 tons, moved, arranged, and stacked by hand, without metal tools, without the wheel, without any technology we would recognize as adequate to the task. It was built sometime between 3500 and 2700 BC, placing it in the same broad era as Stonehenge and the earliest Egyptian pyramids, a period when, across seemingly unconnected parts of the world, human communities were investing extraordinary collective effort into structures of stone that served purposes beyond simple shelter or storage. Archaeologists have studied Rujm el-Hiri for decades, and the honest summary of what they have concluded is this: they are not entirely sure what it was for. The most widely accepted interpretation is astronomical. Research has shown that the monument aligns with the rising sun at the summer solstice. On the longest day of the year, light enters the northeastern gateway of the outer ring in a way that appears deliberate and precise. Some researchers have also identified alignments with the winter solstice sunrise and with certain star risings, suggesting the structure may have functioned as a kind of calendar, a fixed point in the landscape that allowed its builders to track the movements of the sky with accuracy across generations. This interpretation is credible and well supported. Agricultural communities in this period had strong, practical reasons to monitor the solar calendar. Planting, harvesting, the management of livestock and water all depend on knowing where you are in the year. A monument that marks the solstice is not mystical in function. It is useful. But the scale of Rujm el-Hiri resists purely utilitarian explanation. You do not need 40,000 tons of basalt to track the solstice. A single upright stone, properly positioned, achieves the same result. The rings, 5 of them, concentric, carefully constructed, suggest something beyond function. They suggest meaning. Layered, structured, architecturally deliberate meaning. What that meaning was is where the interpretations begin to diverge. Some researchers have proposed that the site served a ceremonial or ritual purpose connected to the dead. A dolmen, a megalithic tomb structure, stands at the central cairn, and human remains have been found there, though dating them precisely has proven difficult. If the center of the monument is a tomb, then the ring surrounding it may represent something like a sacred enclosure, a boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, marked in stone at a scale that communicated permanence, authority, or reverence. Others have suggested the site functioned as a gathering place. a regional center where communities from across the plateau came together at astronomically significant moments for ceremonies, trade, or the negotiation of social relationships. The effort required to build Rujm el-Hiri implies coordination across multiple groups over an extended period. It was not built by one family or one village. It required a shared project, sustained across what may have been generations of labor. What brought those people together? What idea was powerful enough to organize that level of collective effort in a landscape with no obvious defensive or agricultural advantage? The Golan Plateau is not an easy place to live. Water is scarce. The basalt terrain is hard on tools and feet alike. And yet someone chose this specific location, on this specific plateau, and decided that here, in this exposed and windswept place, was where the monument needed to be. Perhaps because of the sky. From the center of Rujm el-Hiri, the horizon is unobstructed in every direction. Nothing interrupts the view of the sun's movement, the stars rising and setting, the slow procession of the cosmos overhead. Whatever the builders were tracking, or honoring, or communicating with, they wanted to do it from a place where the sky was everything. The site remains only partially excavated. Much of what lies within and beneath the stone rings has not yet been formally studied. The central cairn has not been fully investigated. There may be more beneath those walls than has yet been found. A monument built to face the sky in a landscape that offers nothing but sky, and at its center, the dead. What did the people who built Rujm el-Hiri believe connected those two things? The movement of the sun and the stillness of the grave. Rujm el-Hiri leaves us looking upward. That is what it was built to do, to orient the living toward the sky, toward the movements of the sun and stars, toward whatever those ancient builders believed resided in the space above the plateau. At its center, the dead. Above it, the cosmos. And between them, the monument itself, a human attempt to hold those two things in relationship. But not every ancient attempt to connect the living with something beyond them looked upward. Some looked inward. Some looked sideways, across the boundary between the human world and the animal one. What we encounter next is quieter than anything we have examined so far. Smaller, more intimate, and in some ways more unsettling for precisely that reason. We remain in the broader region of the southern Levant and move eastward, into the arid steppe of what is now Jordan, a landscape of low, rolling hills and dry riverbeds, where the desert is not dramatic but simply persistent, stretching in every direction with a kind of patient indifference to human presence. It is the kind of place that feels ancient without effort, where the silence is not empty, but full of something that resists easy naming. Near a site called Kharaneh in the eastern Jordanian steppe, archaeologists excavating a Natufian period camp discovered something they had not expected, and something that, the more carefully they examined it, refused to yield a comfortable explanation. In a shallow grave, buried together, were the remains of two individuals. One was human, the other was a fox. Not placed nearby, not deposited separately in adjacent pits. Together, arranged in a single burial, in close physical proximity, in a way that suggested the relationship between them was the point. Kharaneh dates to approximately 19,000 to 12,000 BC, placing it firmly in the Epipaleolithic period, a time before agriculture, before permanent settlement, before the kinds of social and religious complexity we typically associate with elaborate mortuary ritual. The people who camped at Kharaneh were mobile hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, living in temporary structures, carrying what they needed and leaving much behind when they moved on. And yet they buried their dead with intention. Multiple human burials have been found at the site, some containing grave goods, ochre, shells, objects that imply a belief in something beyond simple biological death. Kharaneh is, in this sense, part of a broader pattern in the Natufian and pre-Natufian record. Evidence that long before cities or temples or writing, human beings were already investing meaning in the act of burial, already making decisions about how the dead should be treated and what should accompany them. The human fox burial is different in kind, not just in detail. The fox was not a food animal in this context. Its remains show no evidence of butchery. It was not a random inclusion, an animal that happened to die nearby and was swept into the pit. The positioning of the remains and the deliberateness of the single grave indicates that the fox was placed with the human intentionally. They were buried as a pair. The mainstream interpretation among researchers is that this burial reflects an early form of what anthropologists call human-animal relationships in ritual contexts, a recognition that certain animals held symbolic, spiritual, or social significance beyond their practical value. Foxes appear with striking frequency in the archaeological record of this region and period. At the site of Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, fox imagery is carved into the great stone pillars with a prominence that suggests the animal occupied a meaningful place in the symbolic vocabulary of the people who built it. At other Natufian sites, fox teeth have been found as ornaments and grave goods. The fox in this world was not simply a wild animal to be avoided or hunted. It was something else, a presence that meant something. What it meant is harder to recover. Some researchers have proposed that the human fox burial at Kharaneh represents an early instance of shamanic practice, a worldview in which certain individuals maintained special relationships with specific animals, relationships understood as spiritual partnerships or extensions of identity. In many indigenous traditions documented ethnographically around the world, the shaman's relationship with an animal guide or familiar is not metaphorical. It is understood as real, functional, and requiring acknowledgement even in death. To bury a person with their animal counterpart would, in this framework, be not unusual but necessary. A recognition that the two were, in some meaningful sense, one. It is a framework that cannot be proven from the archaeological record alone. But it cannot be dismissed either, because the burial itself is the kind of evidence that frameworks are built to explain, and the shamanic interpretation fits the available data as well as any other. Others have suggested the pairing reflects a totemic relationship, the human belonging to a social group that identified with the fox as its founding animal or ancestral symbol. In this reading, the burial is a statement of identity as much as affection. This person and this animal belong together because their people and this animal belong together. What is striking across all the interpretations is what they share: the assumption that the relationship between this specific human and this specific fox was considered significant enough to mark in the most permanent way available to these people. They had limited resources. They carried their lives on their backs, and they chose to use the act of burial, one of the most deliberate and meaning-laden acts in the human repertoire, to say something about a bond between a person and an animal. The grave at Kharaneh is one of the earliest known examples of a human buried with an animal in a way that implies relationship rather than utility. It predates the domestication of the dog. It predates agriculture. It sits at a moment in human prehistory when the boundaries between the human world and the animal world were, perhaps, understood very differently than they are today. What did it feel like in that world to recognize something of yourself in a fox? To look at an animal and see not prey, not threat, but companion, something so essential to who you were that death itself could not be allowed to separate you? And what does it mean that this impulse, to reach across the boundary between species in the moment of burial, appears so early, so fully formed, so long before we think of ourselves as having begun? The burial at Kharaneh 4 stays with you as a gesture of tenderness, ancient, quiet, and somehow legible across 19,000 years. Whatever that person believed about the fox beside them, the act itself is recognizable. A relationship honored. A bond refused to be broken by death. There is something in it that does not feel entirely foreign. What comes next feels entirely foreign. We leave the intimate scale of a single grave and travel to the opposite end of the spectrum, to a site where the dead are not one or two, but dozens, and where the circumstances of their end resist every comfortable framework we have encountered so far. We travel to northeastern China, to the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, where the grasslands stretch toward the horizon in every direction, and the wind moves through the long grass in slow, visible waves. It is a landscape of enormous, quiet scale, the kind of place where human settlements feel small against the land rather than imposed upon it. And here, in a Neolithic village called Hamin Mangha, archaeologists excavating in 2011 made a discovery that has been described, with careful understatement, as one of the most significant and disturbing prehistoric finds in East Asian archaeology. Hamin Mangha is a Neolithic settlement associated with the Hongshan culture, a complex prehistoric society that flourished in northeastern China roughly between 4,500 and 3,000 BC. The Hongshan are not obscure. They are known for sophisticated jade carving, elaborate ceremonial objects, and a level of social organization that suggests something approaching early urbanism. They built temples. They maintained long-distance trade networks. They were, by any reasonable measure, a fully developed civilization in the making. The village at Hamin Mangha was, by all appearances, an ordinary settlement. Houses arranged in a coherent layout, pottery consistent with domestic use, evidence of the kind of daily life that leaves behind the quiet residue of meals prepared and tools maintained and children grown. A community functioning as communities do. And then, in one of the houses, everything stopped. Inside a single structure, a house roughly 6 meters long, archaeologists found the remains of at least 97 individuals. Possibly more, as excavation continues. Men, women, and children, ranging across all age groups, their bones densely packed into a space that could not have comfortably held a fraction of that number in life. The remains were not arranged. They were not buried in the formal sense. They were, in the language of the excavation report, simply there, layered, overlapping, in a state that indicated they had been placed or had fallen into the structure in a relatively short period of time and left. The house was then sealed. Whether by collapse, fire, or deliberate closure, the structure became, in effect, a mass tomb, unintended or otherwise. The bones show no evidence of the kind of processing found at Domuztepe. These individuals were not defleshed or consumed. They were not arranged with the deliberateness of the Ofnet deposits. The working interpretation among the Chinese and international archaeologists who have studied the site is that Hamin Mangha represents a catastrophic mortality event, a sudden, overwhelming death that took an entire community or a significant portion of one, faster than the survivors, if there were any, could manage individual burial. The leading hypothesis is epidemic disease. The demographic spread of the dead, all ages, both sexes, is consistent with the indiscriminate toll of infectious illness rather than the selective pattern of warfare or ritual killing, which tend to concentrate among specific groups. The density of the remains and the apparent speed of deposition suggests that people were dying faster than they could be individually attended to. If that interpretation is correct, Hamin Mangha may represent one of the earliest archaeological signatures of epidemic disease in human prehistory. A community overwhelmed so quickly and so completely that the normal mechanisms of mortuary practice simply could not keep pace. That is a deeply sobering thought. Not because epidemic disease is unfamiliar to us, we know very well what it looks like, but because this evidence places that experience at 3000 BC, in a thriving Neolithic village in northeastern China, among people who had jade and ceremony and trade and houses with plastered floors. People who had built something. People who had, in every material sense, arrived at a form of civilization. And then, in what may have been a matter of weeks, it ended. But the epidemic hypothesis, persuasive as it is not the only interpretation researchers have considered. Some have noted that the spatial concentration of the remains, densely packed in a single structure rather than distributed across the settlement, raises questions that pure epidemic mortality does not fully answer. If people were dying throughout the village, why are the remains concentrated here? Was this structure a place where the sick were gathered, intentionally or by necessity? Was it a house of the dying? A place of isolation or care that became, when the crisis peaked, a place of mass death? Or was the structure chosen afterward, a decision made by survivors or by people from outside the community, to gather the dead into a single place for reasons that were practical or ritual or both? The absence of grave goods, the absence of any evident ceremony, the sheer density of the deposit, all of it points toward emergency rather than intention, and yet someone sealed the building. Someone made a decision about what to do with this house full of the dead and chose, for whatever reason, to close it rather than clear it. That decision, to leave them there, together, and seal the door, is the last human act recorded at Hamin Mangha. 97 people, maybe more, in a house that was never meant to hold them. A village that was thriving and then was not. A door that someone closed and did not open again. What did the person who sealed that building believe they were doing? Containing something, honoring something, or simply accepting that some things are too large to undo? The sealed house at Hamin Mangha represents a particular kind of ending. Sudden, overwhelming, and passive. Whatever killed those 97 people moved faster than human response could manage. There was no preparation, no ceremony commensurate with the scale of the loss. Just the dead and the door and the silence that followed. But not all mass death in the ancient world was passive. Not all of it arrived uninvited. Some of it was delivered. We travel now to northeastern Africa, to the stretch of the Nile Valley where the river cuts through the Sudanese desert before crossing into what is now southern Egypt. It is an ancient landscape in the truest sense. The Nile has been shaping this terrain and the lives of the people along it for longer than recorded history reaches. The cliffs here are sandstone, warm-colored, eroded into soft forms by millennia of wind. The desert presses close on both sides of the river, and in that desert, things are preserved with an almost unnerving completeness. In the mid-1960s, archaeologist Fred Wendorf led an expedition to a site on the west bank of the Nile, just north of the Sudanese border, in an area that was about to be flooded by the construction of the Aswan High Dam. The excavation was, in part, a rescue mission, a race to document what the rising waters would soon cover forever. What Wendorf found at the site known as Jebel Sahaba was a cemetery. 61 individuals, buried in a stretch of desert that had once sat near the Nile's edge. Men, women, and children. Some buried alone, some in small groups, in shallow graves cut into the sandy soil. The cemetery dated to approximately 13,000 to 10,000 BC, the late Paleolithic period, a time when the Nile Valley was experiencing severe environmental stress. The climate was shifting, resources were contracting, and the people who lived along the river were, the evidence suggests, under pressure that expressed itself in ways that left permanent marks on the archaeological record. Those marks were on the bones. Of the 61 individuals buried at Jebel Sahaba, The majority showed clear evidence of violent death. Stone projectile points, small, sharp, deliberately made weapons, were found embedded in or associated with the skeletal remains. Some were lodged in bone. Others lay in positions that indicated they had been inside the body at death, the surrounding tissue long since gone. Multiple individuals bore wounds on multiple parts of their bodies. Not a single blow, but repeated impacts. The kind of pattern consistent not with accident or execution, but with sustained attack. When Wendorf published his findings, Jebel Sahaba became known as the earliest known evidence of organized, group-on-group violence in the archaeological record. A prehistoric war cemetery. A place where the casualties of repeated conflict had been gathered and interred over what may have been an extended period. Not a single battle, but an ongoing state of violence that claimed lives again and again, across years or perhaps generations. That interpretation has held largely for decades. More recent reanalysis of the remains, conducted with modern forensic techniques unavailable to Wendorf in the 1960s, has refined and in some ways deepened the picture. The 2021 reanalysis by a team led by Isabel Crèvecoeur confirmed the presence of traumatic injuries on a significant proportion of the individuals, while also noting the complexity of distinguishing between healed wounds, injuries survived, and perimortem trauma inflicted at or near the time of death. Some individuals bore both, suggesting they had lived through earlier violence before dying in a subsequent encounter. This detail changes the texture of what Jebel Sahaba represents. These were not simply victims. They were survivors who became victims, people who had already experienced violence, recovered, continued living, and then died violently again. They existed in a world where conflict was not an event, but a condition. The environmental context is crucial here, and researchers have been careful to situate the violence within it. The period of Jebel Sahaba's use coincides with a documented episode of significant climate deterioration in the Nile Valley. Reduced rainfall, lower river levels, contracting resources. Competition for those resources, particularly the fertile strips of land closest to the water, would have been intense. In this reading, the violence at Jebel Sahaba is not evidence of some innate human drive toward war, but of what happens to communities under sustained environmental pressure, when the things necessary for survival become scarce enough that organized violence becomes, in the brutal calculus of survival, a rational response. That explanation is sobering precisely because it is not exotic. It does not require us to imagine these people as fundamentally different from ourselves. It requires only that we imagine scarcity, real, grinding, generational scarcity, and ask what it does to the social bonds that normally hold violence in check. What remains harder to explain is the burial itself. Whoever interred the dead at Jebel Sahaba did so with evident care. The graves are individual, the bodies positioned with intention. In a context of ongoing violence and resource scarcity, the continued practice of formal burial represents an investment of time and energy that the community clearly considered non-negotiable. Even in the midst of conflict, even with people dying faster than stability could be maintained, the dead were given graves. That insistence, on ceremony, on individual acknowledgement, even under conditions that might have justified simply leaving the dead where they fell, says something about what these people held on to when everything else was under pressure. What it says exactly is not fully recoverable, but the graves are there, cut into the desert above the Nile, each one a deliberate act performed by someone who believed it mattered. 13,000 years ago, on the edge of a shrinking river, people were burying their dead with care, while the same violence that killed them continued outside the cemetery's boundary. What does it mean to maintain that ritual, that insistence on honoring the dead, in a world that has become, by every material measure, A place where survival crowds out everything else? And what does it tell us that they did? Jebel Sahaba leaves us with a question about what people hold on to when the world is falling apart. The answer, at least along that stretch of the Nile 13,000 years ago, was this: the ritual, the grave, the insistence that each person who died deserved to be placed in the earth with intention, regardless of the circumstances that brought them there. It is a thread that runs through nearly everything we have examined in this exploration. From the eye idols of Tel Brak to the sealed house at Hamin Mangha, from the layered burials of Salango to the heads arranged in ochre at Ofnet. What connects them is not violence or mystery alone, but the persistent human refusal to let death be meaningless. The persistent need to do something with the dead that goes beyond disposal. Nowhere in the entire prehistoric record is that refusal more staggering, more costly, more elaborate, more impossible to explain away than at a site in central Russia that most people have never heard of. We travel now to the Vladimir region of Russia, roughly 200 kilometers northeast of Moscow, where the landscape is flat and heavily forested, and the winters are long and brutal. It is not a dramatic landscape. There are no cliffs, no canyons, no obvious reason why this particular stretch of ground should hold anything remarkable. And yet, beneath it, discovered during construction work in 1955, lay one of the most extraordinary burial sites ever found anywhere on Earth. The site is called Sungir. It was occupied approximately 34,000 years ago, deep in the Upper Paleolithic, at a time when modern humans had only recently spread into Europe, when Neanderthals may still have existed on the continent's fringes, and when the climate was locked in a glacial cold that made survival in this region a formidable challenge. The people of Sungir were hunter-gatherers, living in small, mobile groups, with no agriculture, no permanent architecture, no writing, no metal. By the conventional markers we use to measure civilizational complexity, they were near the beginning of the human story. What they left behind suggests otherwise. The first burial found at Sungir was that of an older man, estimated to have been around 40 to 60 years of age, which in this period and environment represented a genuinely advanced age, a life that had survived decades of cold, scarcity, and physical hardship. He was buried, lying on his back, his body covered in red ochre, the same pigment that appears again and again across prehistoric burial sites on multiple continents, as if something about the color red carried a meaning that transcended geography and culture. But it was what he was wearing that stopped the excavators. Sewn onto his clothing, painstakingly, individually, one by one, were approximately 3,000 mammoth ivory beads. Researchers who have studied the site have estimated that producing a single bead of this type, from raw ivory, using the tools available at the time, would have required somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour of skilled labor. 3,000 beads. 3,000 hours of work, minimum, invested in the ornamentation of a single burial. He also wore foxtooth pendants, ivory bracelets, and a carved ivory pendant near his chest. The total assemblage of grave goods buried with this one individual represents a quantity of skilled labor and material wealth that is, by any measure, astonishing for this period in human prehistory. But the older man was not the most remarkable burial at Sungir. Nearby, in the same site, excavators found a second grave, and what was inside it has never stopped generating questions. 2 children, buried head-to-head in a single elongated grave. A boy estimated at around 12 to 14 years of age. A girl estimated at 9 to 10. They lay facing upward, their heads nearly touching, their bodies extending in opposite directions along the length of the grave. Each of them was adorned with thousands of ivory beads, more than 4,000 on the boy, more than 5,000 on the girl. Between them lay extraordinary objects, a flattened ivory lance nearly 2.5 meters long, straightened from a curved mammoth tusk through a process that required soaking and controlled heat, a technically demanding procedure that speaks to a level of craft mastery entirely unexpected at this date. There were also carved ivory animals, a carved human figurine with a carefully shaped face, and more fox teeth, more pendants, more evidence of accumulated wealth and skilled production than most sites of this era contain in their entirety. The children at Sungir were not simply buried. They were sent somewhere with extraordinary provisions. The mainstream interpretation is that these burials reflect a society with emerging social hierarchy, individuals, perhaps, of high inherited status, whose position in the community was marked and reinforced through the elaborateness of their funeral rites. The older man may have been a chief, a shaman, a person of recognized authority. The children, buried with even greater wealth, may have occupied a ritual or social role that conferred status independent of age, or may have been the children of someone so powerful that their deaths required a demonstration of communal investment at scale. There is also a more uncomfortable possibility that researchers have not shied away from raising. The physical analysis of the children's remains has revealed some unusual features, skeletal anomalies, and signs of developmental stress that have led some scientists to suggest these were not typical members of the community. Some have proposed they may have been individuals set apart from birth, marked perhaps for a specific role that ended in this grave. What that role might have been, and whether it was chosen or assigned, is a question the bones cannot answer. What the bones can tell us is that these two children, 34,000 years ago, in the depths of a Russian winter, were buried by people who spent an almost incomprehensible amount of time and care, preparing them for whatever came next. People who believed that what came next was real enough and important enough to warrant 10,000 ivory beads and a lance of straightened mammoth tusk and hours, weeks, possibly months, of collective labor. The world those people inhabited was cold and hard and offered no margin for waste. Every hour spent making a bead was an hour not spent hunting or gathering or preparing food for winter. And yet they made 34,000 of them for 3 graves. That choice, that extraordinary, costly, logistically demanding choice, is the most articulate thing the people of Sungir ever said to us. They left no words, they left no images on cave walls that we have found. They left graves, and those graves say, with a clarity that crosses 34,000 years without any loss of force, we believed in something. We believed in it enough to pay for it with everything we had. What was it that they believed? And how did they know, without writing, without tradition as we understand it, without any of the structures we rely on to transmit meaning across generations? How did they know that it was worth it? The people of Sungir leave us holding a question about belief, about what it means to invest everything you have into a conviction you cannot prove and cannot explain, only feel. 34,000 ivory beads say something about the depth of that conviction. They say it quietly and they say it with absolute certainty. But Sungir is a site of the Ice Age, of small bands moving through frozen landscapes, of a world so remote from our own that its mysteries feel, in some sense, safely distant. What we turn to now is different in character. This is not prehistory, this is civilization, fully formed, literate, diplomatically sophisticated, connected by trade routes to Egypt and Mesopotamia and the Hittite Empire. And yet, what was found beneath one of its great palaces is as strange, as unresolved, and as quietly disturbing as anything we have encountered in the deep prehistoric past. We travel to Syria, to the flat, dry plains of the central Syrian interior, where the ancient city of Qatna once stood as one of the most powerful urban centers of the 2nd millennium BC. Qatna is not a household name in the way that Babylon or Thebes is, but in its time, roughly 2000 to 1340 BC, it was a city of genuine regional importance. It commanded trade routes, corresponded with the Egyptian pharaoh, and built monuments of considerable ambition. Its rulers sat at the intersection of the great powers of the ancient Near East, navigating the complex politics of an era when empires were still learning the grammar of diplomacy. The city was built on a tell, the familiar layered mound of accumulated occupation. And beneath the royal palace, excavated by a joint Syrian-German-Italian team beginning in the late 1990s, archaeologists discovered something that had remained sealed for more than 3,000 years: a royal tomb complex, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the palace, accessible through a concealed staircase descending from the palace floor above. Multiple chambers, connected by narrow passages cut with evident skill into the living rock. And inside those chambers, an assemblage of human remains, grave goods, and ritual objects that was extraordinary in its preservation and deeply puzzling in its arrangement. The tomb had been in use for generations. Multiple members of the royal family, it appears, had been interred here over an extended period, their remains accumulated in the chambers as the dynasty continued above. Bones from different individuals were found mixed together, not through disturbance or accident, but in ways that suggested deliberate rearrangement. Earlier burials had been moved, reorganized, to make room for later ones, and in the process the remains of different individuals had been brought into physical contact and proximity in ways that seem intentional rather than merely practical. Among the grave goods were objects of remarkable quality and origin: Egyptian alabaster vessels, Mycenaean pottery, cylinder seals, carved ivory. The international character of the assemblage reflects Qatna's position as a node in the diplomatic and commercial networks of the late Bronze Age. These were not provincial rulers. They were connected, cosmopolitan, and wealthy enough to accumulate objects from across the known world. But it is not the wealth that defines Qatna's tomb. It is what happened to it. Sometime around 1340 BC, the palace above was destroyed, burned, violently, in what the archaeological evidence suggests was a deliberate act of destruction rather than accident. The destruction is attributed by most researchers to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma III, who campaigned aggressively through the region during this period, and whose armies brought several Syrian cities to ruin. Qatna burned. The palace collapsed into itself, and as it burned, the tomb beneath was sealed, not by human hands preparing for an ending, but by the catastrophic weight of the collapsing structure above. The ceiling of the tomb held, the chambers survived, and within them, preserved by the very destruction that ended the city above, the contents of the royal burial complex waited in the dark for 33 centuries. What the excavators found when they finally entered was a scene that had not been touched since the moment of destruction. Pottery vessels still sitting where they had been placed, bones arranged as the last person to tend the tomb had left them. The evidence of the final ritual acts performed in that space, offerings made, objects positioned, the dead attended to, frozen in place by the catastrophe above. It is the kind of preservation that archaeologists almost never encounter, and it produced findings of exceptional clarity. But clarity, in this case, did not entirely resolve mystery. It deepened it. The mixing of remains, the deliberate intermingling of bones from different individuals, has prompted sustained discussion about what the tomb's users believed about the dead and their ongoing relationship with the living. In the ancient Near East, the concept of ancestor veneration was not abstract. The dead were understood to retain agency, to require continued attention, and to be capable of both blessing and harming the living, depending on how well they were tended. The royal tomb at Qatna was not a place of final disposal. It was a place of ongoing relationship, a site that the living visited, maintained, and interacted with across generations. The rearrangement of remains in this framework was not disrespectful. It was custodial. The dead were being managed, organized, kept in a state of ritual order that maintained the relationship between the dynasty and its ancestors in good working condition. Some researchers have noted that certain objects in the tomb appeared to have been curated over time, moved, repositioned, kept in circulation within the burial complex across multiple generations of use. This is not simply a tomb that was filled and forgotten. It was tended, visited, used as a site of active ritual practice by people who believed the dead within it were present in a meaningful sense. What those ritual practices looked like, what was said, what was done, what the living believed they were accomplishing when they descended that staircase into the rock cut dark, is not recoverable from the physical evidence alone. The objects are there. The bones are there. The extraordinary preservation captures the arrangement, but not the meaning. And then the Hittites came, and the palace burned, and the staircase was sealed under 3,000 years of debris, and whatever living tradition had maintained that knowledge, whatever chain of transmission had carried the meaning of those rituals from one generation to the next, was broken. The last person to descend those stairs left the tomb as they always had, climbed back into a palace that was, in a matter of hours or days, going to cease to exist. They did not know it was the last time. They could not have known. They left the dead arranged as they should be, the offerings in their proper places, the relationship between the living and the ancestors maintained in good order. And then the fire came, and the ceiling held, and the dead kept waiting, in perfect, preserved, unvisited stillness, for someone who was never going to return. What does it mean to tend a relationship across generations? To build an entire ritual system around the belief that the dead remain present and require attention, and then to have that system end, not through choice or transformation, but through fire and collapse and the simple, brutal fact that the city above no longer existed. The tomb at Qatna ends with a kind of stillness that is almost unbearable in its completeness. A relationship tended across generations. A ritual system built to maintain the bond between the living and the dead. And then, in a single afternoon of fire and collapse, the chain broken. The dead left waiting, the living gone. It is a story about what happens when civilization ends. When the structures that give meaning to daily life, the dynasties, the rituals, the shared understanding of what the dead require, are simply erased by force. But Qatna's ending, for all its violence, was the ending of a palace, a dynasty, a specific royal tradition. What we turn to now is something larger and more total. Not the end of a royal line, the end of an entire community. And the evidence it left behind is not preserved in careful, unbroken stillness. It is scattered, broken, and unmistakably the product of extreme violence visited upon ordinary people. We travel to Lower Austria, to the gentle, agricultural landscape of the Weinviertel region, where the fields are wide and the soil is deep and the land has been farmed continuously for thousands of years. It is a landscape of quiet productivity, unremarkable in the most reassuring sense of the word. And here, near the modern town of Asparn and Derzaya, at a site known as Schletz-Asparn, archaeologists excavating a Neolithic settlement uncovered evidence of an event so complete and so catastrophic that it has become one of the central reference points in the study of prehistoric violence in Europe. The settlement belongs to the linear band ceramic culture, known in the literature as the LBK, a farming culture that spread across Central Europe roughly between 5500 and 4500 BC, representing the first wave of agricultural settlement in the region. The LBK people built longhouses, kept cattle and pigs, grew wheat and barley, and established villages that persisted across generations. They were, in material terms, the foundation of European farming civilization, the people who first brought the Neolithic way of life from its origins in the Near East into the forests and river valleys of Central Europe. The village at Schletz was substantial. Enclosed by a ditch, a common feature of LBK settlements, interpreted variously as a boundary marker, a drainage system, or a defensive fortification. It housed what appears to have been a community of meaningful size, engaged in the ordinary rhythms of agricultural life. And then, sometime around 5000 BC, something happened. In the enclosure ditch surrounding the settlement, excavators found human remains. Not in formal graves, not arranged with intention, but deposited, scattered, fragmented, intermingled, in a way that indicated they had not been buried with care. They had been left where they fell, or moved only minimally, and over time had settled into the ditch that had once defined the boundary of the living community. The number of individuals represented in the deposit is estimated at around 200. Men, women, and children. The demographic profile is striking in what it lacks as much as in what it contains. Young women of reproductive age are significantly underrepresented in the remains. This absence is one of the most discussed and debated features of the Schletz assemblage, because it implies not simply killing, but selection. Whatever happened here, someone made distinctions. Someone took people away. The skeletal trauma is extensive and consistent across the assemblage. Blunt force injuries to the skull, the kind produced by a club or similar weapon delivered from above and behind, appear on a significant proportion of the individuals. The pattern of injury is, in the careful language of the forensic analysis, consistent with systematic execution rather than the chaotic trauma of open battle. These were not people who died fighting. Many of them appeared to have died while kneeling or prone, or otherwise in a position that made the back of the skull accessible to a blow from above. The mainstream interpretation is that Schletz represents a massacre, a deliberate, organized attack on a farming village by an outside group, resulting in the killing of the majority of its population and the apparent abduction of others, specifically young women. The evidence of systematic execution suggests the killing was not frenzied or incidental, but conducted with a degree of organization and intent that implies planning. Within the broader LBK archaeological record, Schletz is not entirely isolated. Other sites from this period and culture, Talheim in Germany, Asparn itself, Herxheim, show similar evidence of mass violence, suggesting that the late LBK period was marked by a significant intensification of intergroup conflict across Central Europe. Researchers have proposed various explanations: resource competition as agricultural land became scarcer, social fragmentation as the LBK cultural horizon began to collapse, the pressures of a changing climate affecting harvests and herd sizes. What makes Schletz particularly haunting is the completeness of what was lost. This was not a military outpost or a fortified stronghold. It was a village, a place where people grew food and raised children, and maintained the 10,000 small habits of daily life that constitute a community. The longhouses stood. The enclosure ditch was dug. And then one day, without adequate warning or effective defense, it ended. The absence of young women in the remains has generated sustained discussion that goes beyond the forensic. It implies survivors, people taken from this place and incorporated, against their will, into another community. It implies that the story of Schletz did not end at the ditch. It continued elsewhere, in the lives of people who carried the memory of what had happened to their village into a future they had not chosen. No burial was performed for the dead at Schletz. No one came after to gather the remains, apply ochre, arrange the bones with intention. The village was abandoned. The ditch filled slowly with the passage of time, and the accumulation of soil, and the dead remained in it, in the disorder of the last moments, until excavation found them 7,000 years later. It is the absence of burial that speaks most directly. Every site we have examined in this exploration, from Kharaneh 4 to Qatna, from Jebel Sahaba to Sungir, has involved, at its core, someone making a decision about what the dead deserve. Someone performing an act of acknowledgement, however costly, however strange. At Schletz, no such act was performed. The dead were left. What does that silence mean? Not as an archaeological datum, but as a human fact. A community existed here. It was erased, and no one came back to say so. Was there no one left who knew? Or were the ones who knew too far away, too changed, too absorbed into another life to return? And the young women who were taken, did they remember? Did they tell their children what had happened in a village beside a ditch, on a day that left no monument and no grave? Schletz leaves a particular kind of silence behind it. Not the silence of mystery or ambiguity, the kind we have sat with at site after site in this exploration, where the evidence is strange, but the intent feels, at some level, human and legible. The silence of Schletz is different. It is the silence of erasure, a community that existed and was ended, and was not mourned in any way the earth preserved. No ochre, no arrangement, no final gesture of acknowledgement. Every other site we have visited, in its own way, involved someone saying something about the dead. Schletz is defined by the absence of that saying, by the fact that no one came back. And so we leave Austria carrying that absence with us, and we travel east, back toward the ancient heartland of human civilization, back toward the region where so many of the threads we have been following in this exploration were first woven. We go to southeastern Turkey, to the upper reaches of the Tigris River, where the landscape is dramatic and the history is dense and the ground holds, layer by layer, the accumulated record of human life going back further than almost anywhere else on Earth. This is the region of Göbekli Tepe and Çatal Höyük, of Neolithic sites that have rewritten what we thought we knew about the origins of human complexity. It is a landscape that has produced, repeatedly and reliably, discoveries that do not fit the older, simpler narratives about how civilization began. The site is called Körtik Tepe, a tell, like so many we have visited, rising from the flat ground beside the Tigris, or what was once beside the Tigris, before the Ilisu Dam flooded much of the valley in the early 2020s, submerging the site beneath the waters of a new reservoir, in a loss that archaeologists described with barely concealed grief. Excavations conducted between 2000 and 2014 worked against time, extracting what could be extracted before the water came. What they found in those years has quietly become one of the most significant and puzzling bodies of evidence from the pre-pottery Neolithic period in the entire region. Körtik Tepe dates to approximately 10,000 to 9,000 BC, placing it at the very threshold of the Neolithic Revolution, the moment when human societies in this part of the world were beginning the long, complex transition from mobile hunter-gatherer life to settled, semi-permanent communities. The people of Körtik Tepe stood at that threshold. They were not yet farmers in the full sense. There is no definitive evidence of domesticated crops or animals at the site. But they were settled enough to build substantial structures, to maintain a community in one place across generations, and to develop a material culture of striking sophistication. The stone vessels found at Körtik Tepe are among the most remarkable objects of their period anywhere in the world. Carved from chlorite and limestone, they are decorated with geometric and figurative designs of extraordinary complexity and precision, interlocking patterns, animal forms, abstract symbols that appear with enough consistency to suggest they carried specific meaning within a shared symbolic vocabulary. The craftsmanship required to produce these vessels, with the tools available at the time, represents a level of skill and investment that speaks to a community with strong traditions of specialized production and a deep investment in the objects themselves. But it is not the vessels alone that make Körtik Tepe significant. It is what was found beneath the floors. The settlement's inhabitants buried their dead under the floors of their structures, a practice we have encountered before in this exploration, at sites like Ain Ghazal, where the dead were kept physically close to the living as part of an ongoing relationship between the two. At Körtik Tepe, this practice was extensive and consistent enough to suggest it was central to the community's understanding of how the living and the dead should coexist. The dead were not removed from the space of daily life. They were incorporated into it, placed beneath the surfaces where people walked, cooked, slept, and gathered. The burials themselves are varied in their arrangement. Some individuals interred in flexed positions, some extended, some accompanied by objects, and some not. Secondary burial practices are also in evidence. Cases where remains had been moved, rearranged, or partially disarticulated after an initial interment, suggesting that the relationship with the dead did not end with the act of burial, but continued over time through ongoing ritual engagement. Among the most discussed findings are burials that contain unusual combinations of human and animal remains, not the intimate pairing we saw at Kharaneh 4, but more complex assemblages in which the bones of specific animals, particularly birds and snakes, appear in deliberate association with human remains in ways that resist purely practical explanation. The symbolic vocabulary evident in the decorated stone vessels, where animal imagery appears with clear intentionality, seems to extend into the burial record, suggesting a cosmological framework in which certain animals occupied specific roles in the understanding of death, transition, or the afterlife. What that framework looked like in its entirety is not recoverable from the physical evidence alone. But the consistency of the symbolism, appearing on portable objects, on architectural elements, and in the arrangement of the dead, suggests a community with a coherent and developed belief system, not a collection of ad hoc ritual responses to individual circumstances. Some researchers have noted that Körtik Tepe's material culture shows connections to other sites across a wide region. Similarities in vessel decoration and symbolic motifs that appear at Göbekli Tepe, at Sayonu, at sites across the northern Fertile Crescent, suggesting that what we are seeing is not an isolated local tradition, but a node in a broader network of shared belief and practice. The symbolic vocabulary of this period and region was, it seems, more widely distributed and more coherent than the distances between sites would lead us to expect. This raises a question that the evidence gestures toward without answering. What was being communicated across those distances through these shared symbols? What did the snake mean, and the bird, and the particular geometric patterns that recur across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers? Was this a common religion, a shared cosmology, a set of beliefs about death and what follows it that had spread, along with the other elements of Neolithic culture, across the landscape of the ancient Near East? And then the dam came, and the water rose, and Körtik Tepe disappeared beneath the reservoir, not destroyed exactly, but sealed again. This time not by the slow accumulation of time, but by a deliberate modern decision about water and power, and the competing claims of the present on the past. The excavated materials are preserved. The records exist, but the site itself, the ground where those people buried their dead beneath their floors and carved their vessels with symbols we are only beginning to read, is gone. Submerged, like so much of what we have explored in this journey, present but unreachable, holding its remaining answers in a silence that is no longer the silence of the ancient world, but the silence of water. What else did Körtik Tepe know in those unexcavated layers that we will now never be able to ask. The water that covers Körtik Tepe is a particular kind of loss, not the violent erasure of Schletz, not the catastrophic fire of Qatna, but a slow, deliberate submersion. A modern decision that closed a door on questions that were only beginning to be asked. There is something in that image, a site still there, still intact, simply unreachable, that captures something about the nature of archaeological mystery more broadly. So much of what we are looking for is not destroyed. It is simply beyond the reach of the tools we currently have, or the time we have been willing to spend, or the ground we have thought to look beneath. That thought carries us forward, because our next site is also a place where the ground gave up its secrets reluctantly, where excavation arrived late and found a world that had been waiting, undisturbed, for an extraordinarily long time. We travel now to Azerbaijan, to the southern Caucasus, a region that sits at the geographic and cultural crossroads between the Near East, Central Asia, and the edges of Europe. It is a landscape of considerable variety. Mountains in the north and west, the lowland plains of the Kura-Araxes river system in the center, the shores of the Caspian to the east. It is also a landscape whose deep prehistoric past has, until relatively recently, been significantly understudied compared to the sites of Anatolia, the Levant, or Mesopotamia. The Caucasus has long been something of a blind spot in the broader narrative of Near Eastern prehistory, a region that clearly participated in the same broad cultural developments, but whose specific contributions have been harder to document. Mentesh Tepe is helping to change that. The site is a tell, the familiar accumulated mound of long human occupation, located in the Mill Plain of western Azerbaijan near the Kura River. Excavations conducted by a joint Azerbaijani-French team, intensifying from around 2012 onward, have revealed a settlement with a history of occupation stretching from the Neolithic through the Chalcolithic period, roughly spanning the 6th and 5th millennia BC. In the broader chronology of the ancient Near East, this is the period of expanding agricultural settlement, growing social complexity, and the first experiments with the technologies, metallurgy, large-scale architecture, long-distance exchange, that would eventually produce the first cities. Mentesh Tepe was not a city, it was a village, a settled agricultural community of moderate size, engaged in the cultivation of crops and the herding of animals, connected through exchange networks to a wider world of contemporary settlements across the Caucasus and beyond. By the standards of its time and region, it was ordinary in the most fundamental sense, a community doing what communities do, sustained by the accumulated practical knowledge of farming and herding and the social structures that make collective life possible. What makes it extraordinary is what the excavations found beneath the living surfaces of the settlement. The burial record at Mentesh Tepe is, by the standards of the region and period, unusually rich and unusually complex. The dead were interred within the settlement, beneath floors, in pits dug into abandoned structures, in spaces that maintained their physical proximity to the living community in ways that echo the practices we have seen at Körtik Tepe and Ain Ghazal. This was, clearly, a region and a period in which the relationship between the living and the dead was understood as a proximate one, not a relationship managed at a distance, in a cemetery set apart from the spaces of daily life, but one maintained in the same ground the living walked on. But it is the specific character of some of the burials that has drawn the most sustained attention. Among the individuals interred at Mentesh Tepe, researchers identified examples of what is termed secondary burial, cases where remains had been exhumed, manipulated, and reinterred, sometimes in new configurations, sometimes in association with remains from other individuals. Skulls, in particular, appear to have been curated, removed from their original burial contexts and repositioned, sometimes placed with evident intention in locations that suggest they continued to function as ritual objects after the initial interment. Skull curation is not unique to Mentesh Tepe. We have encountered the practice, in various forms, across multiple sites in this exploration. At Ain Ghazal, where skulls were plastered and preserved. At Körtik Tepe, where secondary manipulation of remains was part of the ongoing relationship with the dead. But at Mentesh Tepe, the practice appears within a cultural context, the Caucasian Neolithic and Chalcolithic, that is distinct enough from the Levantine and Anatolian traditions to raise a genuine question about what we are looking at. Is this a shared belief that spread across an enormous region through contact and exchange? Or is it an independent development, a convergence of different cultures on a similar ritual solution to the same fundamental human problem of what to do with the dead and how to maintain relationship with them? The decorated ceramics found at Mentesh Tepe add another layer to this question. The site has produced pottery with geometric decoration that shows clear connections to the broader Domuztepe Shulaveri culture, a Neolithic cultural horizon spread across the southern Caucasus, but also elements that suggest local innovation and adaptation. The material culture of Mentesh Tepe is not simply derivative of its neighbors. It participates in a wider tradition while developing its own character. Some of the ceramic forms found in burial contexts at the site are particularly striking. Vessels apparently produced specifically for funerary use, their forms and decorations distinct from the domestic pottery of daily life. This distinction between objects made for the living and objects made for the dead implies a sophisticated ritual economy, one in which the afterlife, or whatever these people believed followed death, was understood to have its own material requirements, different from but parallel to those of the living. What those requirements were, and what beliefs animated the people who produced these objects, remains a question that the evidence illuminates without fully answering. The ceramics can be described. The burial practices can be documented. The patterns of skull curation and secondary interment can be mapped and analyzed. But the meaning, the cosmological framework within which all of these practices made sense, the story these people told themselves about what death was, and where the dead went and what the living owed them, that meaning has not survived in any recoverable form. It existed. It was real and detailed, and presumably as coherent and internally consistent as any belief system. Generations of people at Mentesh Tepe lived within it, acted on it, produced objects in accordance with it, and arranged their dead in its service. And now it is gone, not submerged like Körtik Tepe, not burned like Qatna, but simply unrecorded. Lost not to catastrophe but to the ordinary passage of time, which erases meaning while preserving the objects that once carried it. What would it change about how we understand this region, this period, this moment in the long story of human belief, if we could read what those funeral vessels were trying to say? The funeral vessels of Mentesh Tepe leave us holding a particular kind of silence. The silence not of violence or catastrophe, but of meaning that outlasted the people who carried it. Objects made with intention, for purposes that were once entirely clear, now legible only in their form and not in their content. We can see that something was being communicated. We can no longer hear what it said. That gap between the physical fact of an object or a body and the meaning that once animated it is the central challenge of everything we have explored in this journey. And it is a gap that our next discovery widens, in the most unexpected and quietly devastating way, by introducing a dimension that none of the sites we have visited so far have brought so directly into focus. Not just what these people believed, but how they suffered, and what, remarkably, they did about it. We travel now to the Indian subcontinent, to the state of Rajasthan in northwestern India, where the landscape shifts from the lush agricultural plains of the Ganges basin into something drier, more austere, more ancient in its textures. The Aravalli Hills run through this region, one of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth, worn by erosion into low, rounded forms that give the land a quality of great age. It is a region with a long human history, inhabited continuously for thousands of years, layered with the evidence of cultures that rose, adapted, and transformed across the millennia. Near the village of Balathal in Udaipur district, an archaeological site of the Ahar Banas culture has been excavated since the 1990s. The Ahar Banas people were Chalcolithic farmers, Copper Age cultivators who occupied this part of Rajasthan roughly between 3000 and 1500 BC. They grew crops, herded cattle, produced distinctive black and red pottery, and built in stone and mud brick. They were contemporaries, broadly speaking, of the great Indus Valley civilization to their northwest, though the relationship between the Ahar Banas culture and the Indus cities remains a subject of active research. They were not a peripheral or marginal people. They were part of a broader network of South Asian complexity that we are still working to fully understand. Excavations at Balathal have produced a rich record of settlement archaeology, the ordinary texture of a Chalcolithic life in this region, preserved in the accumulated layers of the tell. But in 2009, among the human skeletal remains recovered from the site, researchers identified something that stopped the analysis in a way that purely archaeological findings rarely do. A single individual, an adult male, and in his bones, the unmistakable signature of leprosy. The skeletal evidence of lepromatous leprosy, the most severe form of the disease, in which the bacterium Mycobacterium leprae attacks not just the skin and nerves but the bone itself, is specific and recognizable, a characteristic pattern of erosion and remodeling affecting the small bones of the face, the hands, and the feet. The nasal spine recedes. The alveolar bone of the upper jaw resorbs. The bones of the fingers and toes show the destructive changes that accompany the peripheral nerve damage of advanced disease. It is, in the forensic record, an unambiguous signature. The individual from Balathal displayed this signature clearly enough that the researchers who analyzed his remains were confident in their diagnosis. And the dating of those remains, placing this individual at approximately 2500 BC, made this find not simply a medical curiosity, but a landmark in the history of human disease. This is, at the time of its publication, the oldest confirmed skeletal evidence of leprosy in the world. Leprosy is one of the oldest and most historically significant infectious diseases in the human record. Its presence in ancient texts, in the medical literature of India, in the documents of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, in the Hebrew scriptures, has been debated by historians for generations, complicated by the fact that ancient terminology for skin diseases was broad and often inconsistent. Whether the conditions described in these texts represent true leprosy or other skin conditions grouped under the same terminology has been a persistent source of scholarly disagreement. The Balathal skeleton cuts through that disagreement with the directness of physical evidence. Whatever the ancient texts were describing, this individual, in Rajasthan 4,500 years ago, had leprosy in his bones, unambiguously. But it is not the diagnosis alone that makes this discovery significant. It is the context. The individual was found buried within the settlement, interred in the same space where the living community went about its daily life, consistent with the Ahar Banas' mortuary practice of incorporating the dead into the inhabited landscape. This is the practice we have seen repeated in different forms and different regions throughout this exploration. The dead kept close, maintained in relationship with the living, not removed to a separate space of death. What makes the Balathal burial remarkable is what that proximity implies. Lepromatous leprosy is a disfiguring disease. In its advanced stages, it produces changes to the face and extremities that are visible, progressive, and in most historical contexts profoundly stigmatized. The history of leprosy across cultures and centuries is largely a history of exclusion, of affected individuals being separated from their communities, driven from settlements, denied the ordinary transactions of social life. And yet this individual was buried within the community. He was not expelled. He was not left to die alone. He was, the burial implies, a member of the community at the time of his death, accorded the same treatment as his neighbors. The researchers who studied his remains went further than the burial context alone. Analysis of his bones suggested that this man had lived with advanced leprosy for a significant period before his death. The skeletal changes were extensive, indicating a prolonged course of disease rather than a recent infection. He had been ill, visibly and severely ill, for years, and he had survived in a community that knew he was ill, long enough for the disease to progress to the stage recorded in his bones. That survival implies care, not just tolerance, active care. Someone, or many people, had provided this individual with food, shelter, and support across the years of his illness. In a Chalcolithic farming community, where every able-bodied person's contribution to subsistence had direct consequences for the group's survival, maintaining a severely disabled individual represented a genuine material investment. It was not costless, it was a choice. The mainstream interpretation is appropriately cautious. A single burial cannot carry the weight of broad conclusions about social attitudes, and the researchers involved have been careful to note that this individual case may not be representative of the community's general response to disease or disability. What can be said with confidence is that this particular person, in this particular community, was not abandoned. Some researchers have situated the Balathal finding within a broader discussion about the origins of leprosy and its movement across the ancient world. The disease is caused by a slow-reproducing bacterium that is genetically distinctive enough to allow researchers to trace its spread through populations over time. Current genetic and paleopathological evidence suggests that leprosy may have originated in East Africa or the Near East and spread through human movement and trade across Asia and eventually Europe. The Balathal individual sits at a crucial point in that geography, in a region connected, through trade and population movement, to both the Indus Valley civilization and the broader networks of Bronze Age exchange that linked South Asia to the Near East. Did leprosy travel along those networks? Was the Balathal case an isolated occurrence, or a trace of a wider epidemic presence that simply has not yet been confirmed elsewhere in the archaeological record of this period? The answer to that question has implications not just for the history of leprosy, but for our understanding of how diseases moved through the ancient world. How the same trade networks that carried pottery styles and metal technology and symbolic motifs across vast distances also carried, invisibly and inevitably, the microorganisms that shaped the biology of every civilization they touched. There is also a question that the physical evidence cannot answer, but that the burial raises with quiet insistence. This man was known in his community. He was seen, his illness was visible, his disfigurement apparent, his dependence on others undeniable. And he was kept, tended, buried with his neighbors when he died. What did his community understand about illness, about obligation, about the relationship between the individual and the group, that produced that response? What belief system, or what simply human instinct, overrode whatever fear or practical calculation might have argued for his exclusion? We do not know what the Aharbanas people believed about sickness. We do not know whether they had a framework for understanding contagion, or whether they conceptualized illness in spiritual rather than biological terms. We do not know whether caring for this man was understood as a religious duty, a social obligation, or simply the unreflective expression of a community that had not yet learned to fear what he carried. What we know is what the bones say, that he was ill for years, and he was not alone, and when he died, someone placed him in the earth with the same care they gave to everyone else. In a history full of sites that document what human beings do to one another in violence and ritual and war, Balathal offers something quieter and, in its own way, just as mysterious. Evidence of what human beings do for one another in the long, unglamorous middle of a life defined by suffering. And the question it leaves behind is not about disease or diagnosis or ancient medicine. It is about something simpler and harder to measure. What did it cost them to keep him? And why did they decide it was worth it? Balathal leaves us with something rare in this exploration. Not the residue of violence or the enigma of ritual, but the quiet, almost unbearable tenderness of a community that chose, at real cost to itself, to keep someone who could not keep himself. It is a finding that resists the dominant narrative of prehistoric life as brutal and short and indifferent to suffering. It insists, through the simple fact of a man buried among his neighbors after years of visible illness, that something else was also true. That care was also part of the record. We carry that thought forward, because what comes next will test it. Not every community in the ancient world responded to crisis with inclusion and care. Some responded with something that the archaeological evidence captures in its full, unsparing detail, and which demands to be looked at directly, without the softening of distance or the comfort of easy explanation. We travel to central Slovakia, to the fertile lowlands of the Nitra River Valley, where the soil is rich and the landscape has supported continuous human occupation since the earliest farming cultures arrived in Central Europe. It is a productive, unremarkable terrain, the kind of place that accumulates history quietly, without drama, simply because it has always been good land and people have always known it. Near the modern town of Rabel, a major Neolithic settlement has been under systematic excavation since 2012, investigated by a consortium of Slovak and German researchers. The settlement is one of the largest known LBK sites in Central Europe, the same linear band ceramic farming culture we encountered at Schletz-Asparn, the same cultural horizon that brought agricultural life from the Near East into the river valleys and forests of the European interior. At its peak, the Vrabel settlement may have housed several hundred people, organized into distinct neighborhood clusters separated by internal boundaries, a degree of internal social complexity that has made it a significant site for understanding how early farming communities organized themselves. The excavations produced the expected record of Neolithic life: longhouses, pottery, animal bones, the ordinary archaeology of a functioning agricultural community. And then, in a pit near the edge of the settlement, they found something that was not ordinary at all: a mass grave. The remains of at least 35 individuals, deposited together in a single feature, in circumstances that left no ambiguity about the nature of what had occurred. The skeletal trauma is extensive. Blunt force injuries to the skull, the same pattern we saw at Schletz-Asparn, delivered from above and behind, consistent with systematic execution rather than open combat. Perimortem fractures on the long bones, evidence of violence that was organized, deliberate, and thorough. The individuals in the Vrabel mass grave did not die in battle. They died at the hands of people who were standing over them, delivering killing blows to the back of the skull. The demographic profile of the victims is, like Schletz, striking in what it excludes. Young women are significantly underrepresented. The dead are predominantly men, older women, and children, a pattern that, when read alongside the evidence from Schletz and other LBK massacre sites, forms a deeply disturbing picture of what organized violence in this period and culture looked like. The consistent absence of young women from the massacre deposits across multiple sites implies consistent selection. A pattern of abduction that accompanied the killing, repeated across different communities and different events, suggesting that this was not random violence but something with a recognizable structure. What Vrabel adds to this picture is chronology. The site's long occupation sequence and the careful stratigraphic work of the excavation team has allowed researchers to situate the mass grave within the settlement's history with unusual precision. The massacre at Vrabel did not come from outside the cultural horizon. It was not an attack by people from a different tradition or a different way of life. The evidence suggests that the perpetrators were people of the same LBK culture as the victims, neighbors in the broadest sense, sharing the same farming practices, the same pottery traditions, the same basic material culture. This is a finding with significant implications. The violence at Vrabel was not the product of a clash between fundamentally different peoples. It was internal, a feature of the LBK cultural world itself, an expression of conflicts that arose within the farming communities of Central Europe rather than between them and some external other. Researchers have spent considerable effort trying to understand what drove this violence. The late LBK period, to which Vrabel and Schletz and Talheim all belong, was a time of significant stress across the Central European agricultural landscape. The first wave of farming settlement had, over several centuries, transformed the environment in ways that created new pressures. Forests had been cleared for fields. Soil fertility in some areas was declining. The population had grown to a point where the available agricultural land could no longer easily absorb further expansion. The communities that had arrived in Central Europe as pioneers, with open land ahead of them, now found themselves in a landscape that was filling up, where the neighbors were close, the boundaries were established, and the resources that everyone depended on were finite and contested. In this context, the violence at Vrabel and the other LBK massacre sites can be understood as the product of resource competition, raiding for land, for cattle, for the reproductive capacity represented by young women, for the basic inputs of agricultural survival in a landscape under pressure. It is a grim but coherent framework, supported by the evidence across multiple sites and consistent with what we know about the environmental conditions of the period. But Vrabel adds a detail that the framework does not entirely absorb. The settlement at Vrabel was not a static community. The excavations have revealed evidence of internal social differentiation, differences in the size and construction quality of longhouses that suggest not everyone in the community occupied the same social position. Some households appear to have been wealthier, more centrally located, more invested in the infrastructure of the settlement. Others appear to have been more marginal, less substantial, differently positioned in the social geography of the site. This internal complexity raises a question that the massacre evidence alone cannot answer. Was the violence at Vrabel purely external, an attack from outside the settlement, or does the social complexity within the community reflect tensions that could also have found violent expression internally? Could the mass grave represent, in part, the product of conflicts within the settlement as much as between it and its neighbors? The answer is not recoverable from the current evidence. The skeletal analysis can document how people died, but not who killed them or why. The demographic profile can suggest patterns, the absence of young women, the presence of children, but cannot reconstruct the specific circumstances that produced them. What can be said is that the community continued after the massacre. The settlement at Vrabel was not abandoned in the way that Schletz appears to have been. Life went on. The longhouses continued to be occupied. The fields continued to be worked. The pottery continued to be made. The community absorbed what had happened, or adapted to it, or was replenished in ways that allowed it to persist, which means that the people of Vrabel, unlike the people of Schletz, lived with the knowledge of what was in that pit. They walked past it. They farmed the land around it. They built their lives in a settlement that contained, somewhere within its boundaries, the remains of at least 35 people who had died violently and been deposited together in the earth. Did they know who was in the grave? Did they know who had put them there? Did they mark the location in any way or perform any ritual acknowledgement of what it contained? The archaeology does not preserve that knowledge. The pit was sealed, and life continued above it, and whatever the surviving community understood about what had happened was carried in memory and conversation, and whatever ritual responses they chose to make, none of which left traces that excavation can recover. There is one final detail that the Vrabel excavations have produced, and it is the kind of detail that resists easy interpretation but refuses to be set aside. Among the remains in the mass grave, researchers identified individuals who showed evidence of healed injuries from prior violent encounters. People who had survived earlier violence, carried the physical marks of it in their bones, and then died in this pit. We have seen this before. At Jebel Sahaba, on the banks of the Nile, 13,000 years ago, individuals who had survived violence once, and then died violently again. A world in which conflict was not an event but a condition. A world in which the body kept a record of everything it had survived, right up until the moment it could survive no more. The distance between Jebel Sahaba and Vrabel is immense, in geography, in time, in culture, and yet the bones tell the same story, healed, then broken again. The body's record of a life lived at the edge of violence, finally ended by it. What does it mean that this pattern, survival followed by death, the healed wound preceding the fatal one, appears across thousands of years and thousands of miles in cultures with no connection to one another? Is it a coincidence of the archaeological record? Or is it the record telling us something about the texture of life in the ancient world that we have not yet found a framework adequate to hold? The bones at Vrabel carry their history in the most literal way possible. Healed fractures that speak of survival. Final fractures that speak of an end that survival could not indefinitely postpone. It is a pattern that follows us through this entire exploration, appearing in different cultures, different landscapes, different millennia, as if the archaeological record itself is insisting on something about the human condition that we keep finding ways to look past. We have spent a great deal of this journey in the presence of violence. Not because the ancient world was defined by violence, the care at Balathal, the beliefs at Sungir, the tenderness of Kharaneh IV all argue against that reduction, but because violence leaves marks on bone, and bone is what survives, and so the record is, in some sense, inevitably shaped by what the body remembers. But there are other kinds of records, other ways that ancient people left traces of what they believed and how they understood the world. And some of those traces are not written in bone at all, but carved into stone, worked into the walls and ceilings of spaces that were built, slowly and deliberately, to hold the dead in a particular kind of embrace. We leave Slovakia and travel southwest, across the European continent to the Mediterranean, to an island that has been inhabited since the Neolithic, that sits at the intersection of sea routes connecting Europe, Africa, and the Near East, and that developed over thousands of years a material culture of striking originality. We go to Sardinia, the large mountainous island off the western coast of Italy, whose prehistoric past is among the richest and least understood in the entire Mediterranean world. Near the modern city of Alghero, in the northwestern corner of the island, a vineyard worker discovered something in 1903 that would eventually be recognized as one of the most significant prehistoric burial complexes in Europe. The site is called Anghelu Ruju, a name drawn from the local Sardinian dialect, its precise meaning debated but its resonance unmistakable to anyone who has stood at the entrance to one of its chambers and looked inside. What the worker found, and what subsequent excavation revealed, was a necropolis, a city of the dead, carved entirely by human hands into the soft limestone bedrock of the Sardinian plateau. Not built above ground, not constructed from stacked stone, but excavated downward and inward, rooms hollowed out of the living rock, connected by passages, accessible through low doorways that required the living to crouch or crawl to enter. There are 38 of these hypogea, underground tomb chambers, at Anghelu Ruju, ranging from simple single rooms to elaborate multi-chamber complexes with antechambers, side rooms, and internal architectural details of considerable sophistication. They were created by the people of the Ozieri culture, a Neolithic society that flourished in Sardinia roughly between 3400 and 2700 BC, contemporaries broadly of the builders of Rujm el-Hiri, of the late phase of Göbekli Tepe, of the first dynasties of Egypt. The Ozieri people were farmers and herders, producers of some of the most distinctive pottery in the prehistoric Mediterranean. Fine ceramics decorated with incised geometric patterns of extraordinary complexity and precision. They built megalithic monuments above ground and excavated elaborate chambers below it. They maintained trade connections across the Mediterranean, as evidenced by the presence of obsidian from the volcanic island of Lipari in their archaeological assemblages. They were, in every sense, a sophisticated and fully developed culture with a rich symbolic life. And nowhere is that symbolic life more fully expressed than in the carved chambers of Anghelu Ruju. The interiors of the hypogea are not merely functional, they are decorated, worked with carved reliefs and painted symbols that cover the walls and ceilings of the burial chambers with a visual language that researchers have been studying for more than a century without reaching consensus on its full meaning. The most prevalent motif is the bull, or, more precisely, the bull's head, rendered in a stylized form known as a bucranium, in which the skull and horns of the animal are represented as a single, powerful image. These bucrania appear repeatedly throughout the complex, carved in relief from the stone walls, painted in red ochre, positioned above doorways and along the walls of the inner chambers in ways that suggest they were not decorative in any casual sense but deeply, deliberately meaningful. The bull was not a random choice. Across the prehistoric Mediterranean, in Anatolia, in the Aegean, in North Africa, in the Iberian Peninsula, the bull appears again and again as a symbol of power, fertility, and the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. At Aşıklı Höyük in Turkey, bucrania were embedded in the walls of houses. At sites across the Maltese Islands, bull imagery appears in temple contexts. The Ozieri people of Sardinia were participating in a symbolic tradition that was genuinely pan-Mediterranean in its reach, a shared visual vocabulary whose exact meanings remain debated, but whose widespread distribution suggests a shared set of concerns about life, death, and the forces that governed both. At Anghelu Ruju, the bucrania are positioned specifically in burial contexts, in the rooms where the dead were placed, above the passages through which the living entered to tend them. Some researchers have interpreted this as apotropaic, protective imagery designed to guard the dead from malevolent forces, or to mark the boundary between the human world and the realm the dead had entered. Others have suggested the bull symbolized regeneration, the power of the animal's vitality, invoked at the threshold of death as an affirmation of continuity, of the cycle that transformed death into something that was not simply an ending. The structural design of the hypogea themselves supports this reading. The low doorways, requiring the living to bow or crawl to enter, have been interpreted as symbolic thresholds, passages that marked the transition from one world to another, that required a physical act of humility or submission from the living who crossed them. The inner chambers, cut to specific proportions and orientations, created spaces that were in some sense architectural. Not just containers for the dead, but rooms with a specific spatial logic, as if the experience of moving through them was part of the ritual itself. The dead at Anghelu Ruju were buried collectively. The hypogea are not individual tombs, but communal ones, chambers used over multiple generations, their deposits accumulating across centuries of use. The remains of dozens of individuals have been found in some of the larger chambers, along with grave goods that span a considerable chronological range: pottery, personal ornaments, stone tools, obsidian blades, and, in the later phases of use, copper objects that mark the transition from the Neolithic into the Chalcolithic. The community of the dead grew over time, in the same way the community of the living did, incrementally, generation by generation, each new death adding to the accumulated presence within the rock. This intergenerational character of the necropolis suggests something important about how the Ozieri people understood the relationship between the living and the dead. The dead did not depart. They remained in the landscape, physically embedded in the bedrock of the plateau, accessible to the living through the carved passages that connected the two worlds. To visit Anghelu Ruju was not to visit a place set apart from life. It was to visit the ancestors, to maintain a relationship that was understood as ongoing and reciprocal, to bring offerings and perform whatever rituals sustained the bond between the generations of the living and the accumulated generations of the dead. Some researchers have noted that the orientation of certain chambers and the positioning of certain carved motifs relative to the movement of light through the entrance passages at specific times of year suggests an astronomical dimension to the complex's design, a connection between the cycles of the sun and the ritual use of the burial chambers that echoes what we saw at Rujm el-Hiri. If confirmed, this would imply that the people of Anghelu Ruju understood the sun's annual cycle and the cycle of life and death as expressions of the same underlying order, that to bury the dead in chambers aligned with the solstice was to locate them within a cosmic pattern rather than simply in the earth. The site was excavated in the early 20th century under conditions that were, by modern standards, insufficiently careful. Much of the stratigraphic information that would allow precise dating and sequencing of the deposits was lost in the initial excavations. More recent work has attempted to recover what can still be recovered, but the necropolis has yielded its secrets unevenly, and significant questions about the sequence and character of its use remain open. What is not in question is the scale of the investment it represents. 38 chambers, carved by hand into bedrock, decorated with imagery of genuine sophistication, maintained and used across centuries. The labor alone, not to mention the symbolic and intellectual effort of designing spaces that were meant to function as thresholds between worlds, speaks to a community for which the dead were not a problem to be managed, but a presence to be honored, housed, and kept close. The bull watches from the walls of every chamber, eyes carved in stone, horns spreading upward from skulls that are both real and symbolic. An image of power placed at the boundary between life and death, repeated in chamber after chamber, generation after generation. What did the Ozieri people believe the bull could do at that boundary? What force did they think they were invoking each time a new body was carried through that low doorway and laid among the accumulated dead? And is it possible that they were right, that there is something at that boundary, something the living have always felt without being able to name, that the bull was simply their way of pointing at it? The bull carved into the walls of Anghelu Ruju watches from a threshold, positioned at the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, as if its function was precisely to mark that passage, to acknowledge it, to give it a form that could be seen and approached and, in some sense, addressed. It is an image of power deployed at the point of maximum vulnerability, a way of saying, we know this boundary exists, and we are not simply walking through it unprepared. That impulse, to mark the threshold, to build a framework around the terrifying fact of death, is one of the oldest and most persistent things we have traced in this exploration. It appears in the eye idols of Tel Brak, in the ivory-laden graves of Sungir, in the carved chambers of Sardinia. It seems to be, in some fundamental sense, part of what human beings do. But when did it begin? How far back does this impulse go? And what did it look like at the very edge of the record, in communities so early that the line between modern human behavior and something older, more experimental, more tentative is genuinely difficult to draw? We travel now to central Anatolia, to the high volcanic plateau of Cappadocia in what is now Turkey, a landscape of extraordinary geological character. The plateau is defined by the remnants of ancient volcanic activity, ash layers compressed into soft stone, eroded by wind and water into the distinctive formations that make this region visually unlike anywhere else on Earth. It is a landscape that feels prehistoric in the most immediate sense. The rock itself is the record of deep time, and human presence within it has always been shaped by and responsive to the specific character of the terrain. Near the Melendez River, in the Aksaray province, a site called Aşıklı Höyük rises from the plain. It is a tell, the familiar accumulated mound, but one of unusual significance. Excavations that began in the 1960s and have continued under the direction of Turkish archaeologist Mihriban Özbaşaran and her team into the present decade have revealed a settlement that dates to approximately 8200 to 7400 BC, making it one of the earliest known permanently settled communities in Anatolia, and possibly in the world. Let that date sit for a moment. 8,200 years before the birth of Christ. This is not simply old in the way that most ancient sites are old. This is old in a way that places Aşıklı Höyük at the very beginning of the Neolithic Revolution in Anatolia, at the moment when human communities were first making the transition from mobile hunter-gatherer life to permanent year-round settlement in a single place. The people of Aşıklı Höyük were not practicing what we would call full agriculture. They hunted wild animals and gathered wild plants alongside the earliest experiments with managed herding. They were, in the technical language of the field, a pre-pottery Neolithic community, without ceramics, without metal, without writing, without the full suite of technologies we associate with settled civilization. And yet they were settled. Permanently, continuously, in one place. The architectural record at Aşıklı Höyük is remarkable for its date. The settlement was organized, structured, with buildings arranged according to a coherent spatial logic, separated by pathways, maintained and rebuilt across multiple generations. The mud brick structures were replaced and rebuilt on the same foundations, layer after layer, producing the stratigraphy that makes the site readable as a sequence of occupation rather than a jumbled deposit. Someone, many someones, across many generations, was maintaining a shared understanding of how the settlement should be organized and where things should be. This implies social coordination of a kind that we do not typically associate with the very earliest stages of settled life. It implies rules, or at least conventions, agreements about space and use, and the organization of collective life that were robust enough to persist across the turnover of generations. But it is what was found beneath the floors, again beneath the floors, that stops the analysis in its familiar way. The dead at Aşıklı Höyük were buried within the settlement. Beneath the floors of buildings, in the spaces between structures, in a pattern of intramural burial that connects this site to the broader tradition we have traced from Ain Ghazal to Körtik Tepe to Mentesh Tepe. The dead were kept within the inhabited space, physically continuous with the living, incorporated into the architecture of daily life. What the Aşıklı Höyük burials add to this picture is a dimension that researchers have found both fascinating and difficult to fully interpret. Analysis of the skeletal remains has revealed evidence of what appears to be a systematic practice of skull removal following burial. In multiple cases, the skull had been detached from the skeleton after decomposition, after the flesh had gone, when the bones were disarticulated, and removed from the burial. Some skulls were then redeposited elsewhere within the settlement, in locations that appear to have been specifically chosen rather than randomly selected. We have seen skull curation before, at Ain Ghazal, where skulls were plastered and given painted features, at Körtik Tepe and Mentesh Tepe, where secondary manipulation of remains was part of an ongoing ritual engagement with the dead. But at Aşıklı Höyük, this practice is documented at a date that pushes the known horizon of intentional skull curation significantly further back than previously confirmed, and in a community that predates pottery, predates agriculture proper, predates most of the cultural complexity we have been associating with this kind of ritual sophistication. What were they doing with the skulls? The honest answer is that we do not know. The removals were deliberate. The pattern is too consistent to be accidental. The redeposition locations appear meaningful. But without any associated symbolic record, without ceramics bearing imagery that might connect to the practice, without architecture that clearly functions as a ritual space distinct from domestic space, the specific meaning of the skull removals at Aşıklı Höyük remains inaccessible. What can be said is that the practice implies a belief, a conviction that the skull, specifically, retained something after death that the rest of the skeleton did not, or that it served a function for the living that required it to be mobile, repositionable, maintained in circulation rather than left in the ground with the rest of the body. Whether that conviction was about the skull as a seat of identity, a vessel of spiritual power, a connection to ancestral authority, or something else entirely that our conceptual vocabulary does not adequately capture, these are questions the evidence raises without answering. The faunal record at Aşıklı Höyük has contributed another layer of complexity to the site's interpretation. The animal bones recovered from the settlement show patterns of use that suggest the community's relationship with animals was not purely subsistence-oriented. Specific species appear in specific contexts, some associated with particular structures, some with burial deposits, in ways that echo the animal-human symbolic associations we encountered at Körtik Tepe and Kharaneh. The wild ass, in particular, appears with a frequency and in contexts that have led some researchers to suggest it held special significance for the Aşıklı Höyük community, beyond its value as a food source. This connects to a broader question about Aşıklı Höyük's place in the story of human domestication. The site's long occupation sequence spans a period during which the domestication of sheep and goats was occurring in Anatolia, and the animal bone assemblages from Aşıklı Höyük show changes over time that may reflect the community's engagement with this process, possibly as early experimenters in the management of wild herds that would eventually become domestic animals. The people of Aşıklı Höyük may have been, among other things, participants in one of the most consequential transformations in human history, the shift from hunting animals to herding them, and may have experienced that transformation not as an abstract economic development, but as a fundamental change in the relationship between the human world and the animal one. What did it mean to these people when an animal that had been wild became something that lived within the boundaries of human settlement? Did that change carry ritual implications as well as practical ones? Did the symbolic significance of specific animals shift as the human-animal relationship shifted? These are questions that Aşıklı Höyük raises with unusual directness, precisely because its occupation sequence spans the moment of transition rather than sitting clearly on one side of it. The site continues to be excavated. Each season produces new material, new burials, new architectural sequences, new animal bone assemblages that add to and complicate the picture. It is, in the best sense, an unfinished story. Here, at one of the earliest permanently settled communities on Earth, people were already removing the skulls of their dead and moving them through the inhabited space of the settlement, already treating death not as a departure, but as a transition that required ongoing management, ongoing attention, ongoing relationship. Before pottery, before agriculture, before almost everything we think of as the foundation of civilization, which raises the question that Aşıklı Höyük ultimately poses about everything we have explored in this journey. Not, when did human beings begin to believe in something beyond death, but whether there was ever a time when they did not. Aşıklı Höyük ends where so many of the deepest questions in this exploration end, not with a discovery that closes a mystery, but with a discovery that moves the horizon further back. The skull removals, the animal symbolism, the carefully maintained spatial order of a community 10,000 years old. All of it points toward a conclusion that the evidence keeps forcing us toward, site by site, burial by burial. That the things we think of as defining human complexity, belief, ritual, the need to make meaning from death, were not late developments, not the products of civilization as we conventionally understand it. They were present at the very beginning. Perhaps they were the beginning. We have followed this thread from Ice Age Russia to Neolithic Turkey, from the plains of Jordan to the carved chambers of Sardinia. And now it takes us somewhere different in character, not to a burial site, not to a place of death or ritual, but to something that, on its surface, seems almost mundane. Stones. Marked stones found in a specific landscape, carrying marks that human hands made deliberately and that human minds have been trying to read ever since. But the simplicity of that description is deceptive, because what these stones may represent, if the more expansive interpretations are correct, is something that would require us to revise, in a fundamental way, what we think we know about when human beings first began to record information in symbolic form. We travel to Romania, to the Carpathian foothills of Valsia County, a region of steep valleys and dense forest where the Olt River cuts through the mountains toward the plains below. It is a landscape with a long human history, but not one that has featured prominently in the mainstream narrative of European prehistory. Romania sits at the eastern edge of what archaeologists call the Starcevo Krish and later Vinca cultural horizons, the great wave of Neolithic farming cultures that spread across southeastern Europe in the 6th and 5th millennia BC, producing settlements of considerable size and complexity, and a material culture that includes some of the most intriguing and debated symbolic objects in prehistoric Europe. The Buila, inscribed stones were discovered in the Buila Vanturărița Massif area, in contexts that have made their precise archaeological provenance difficult to establish with the certainty researchers prefer. This matters because the chain of discovery and documentation affects how the objects can be interpreted. Some were found in association with known archaeological sites. Others were surface finds, their original depositional context unrecoverable. This ambiguity is not a reason to dismiss them, but it is a reason to hold interpretations carefully, at a distance that acknowledges what is known and what is not. The stones themselves are the fact. Flat river stones and limestone pieces, ranging from palm-sized to somewhat larger, bearing incised marks, lines, angles, repeated geometric forms, and in some cases what appear to be more complex arrangements of symbols that resist reduction to purely decorative pattern. The marks were made deliberately, with tools, by people who chose specific stones and applied specific marks to them with enough consistency across multiple examples to suggest that what they were doing was not random. The question that has generated both serious academic discussion and considerable controversy, is what those marks mean and when they were made. The most cautious interpretation situates the Buila stones within the broader context of Vinca culture symbolic objects, a category that is itself one of the most debated topics in European prehistory. The Vinca culture, which flourished in southeastern Europe roughly between 5500 and 4500 BC, produced thousands of objects bearing incised marks, on pottery, on figurines, on clay tablets and spindle whorls in the walls of structures. These marks have been studied intensively since their first documentation in the late 19th century, and the debate about what they represent has not been resolved. Some researchers classify them as a proto-writing system, a set of symbols that function to record or communicate specific information, whose complexity and consistency suggest something beyond decoration. Others argue they were potter's marks, ownership symbols, or ritual signs with specific but non-linguistic meanings. A smaller group has argued, more provocatively, that the Vinca symbol system constitutes the earliest writing in the world, predating the Sumerian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics that conventionally hold that distinction by 1,000 years or more. This claim is significant enough to deserve careful handling. The mainstream consensus in linguistics and archaeology does not accept the Vinca symbols as writing in the technical sense, as a system capable of recording language, of representing specific words or sounds in a form that can be decoded by a trained reader. The argument against is not that the symbols are meaningless, but that the evidence does not support the specific claim that they encode language rather than some other form of information. But the argument is not settled. The Vinca symbol set is large. More than 200 distinct signs have been identified across the corpus of objects, and its internal consistency is remarkable. The same signs appear across a wide geographic area and a long time span, in contexts that suggest they were understood and used by people who shared a common symbolic vocabulary. Whether that vocabulary constituted writing or something functionally adjacent to writing, a recording system that served some of the purposes of writing without meeting the strictest definition, is a question that different researchers answer differently. The Buila stones enter this debate from an angle that makes them particularly interesting and particularly difficult to assess. If they belong to the Vinca cultural horizon, they are part of an already complex and contested symbolic tradition. But some researchers working on the Buila material have proposed dates and interpretations that would place certain of the stones outside that context entirely, suggesting that some of the marks may be older than the Vinca culture, pushing the horizon of intentional symbolic marking in this region back into a period that lacks the cultural context that makes the Vinca symbols at least partially interpretable. If that is correct, and it is a significant if, it would imply that the impulse to mark stone with repeated consistent symbols was present in this part of Europe at a date that challenges even the revised timelines produced by sites like Aşıklı Höyük and Göbekli Tepe. It would suggest that the recording of information in durable form, the attempt to make a mark that outlasts the moment of its making, that carries meaning across time and space, was a feature of human cognition and behavior even earlier than the most expansive current interpretations of the evidence allow. There is a methodological challenge here that is worth naming directly. The Buila stones, like all objects whose provenance is partially uncertain, are vulnerable to the criticism that their significance is being overstated by researchers working outside the disciplinary mainstream, and that the ambiguity of their context has created a space for interpretations that better documented material would not support. That criticism is fair, and it should be held alongside the evidence. But the evidence of the marks themselves is real. The stones exist. The incisions are there, and the patterns they form, the repetition, the consistency, the evident intentionality, are not nothing. They are the traces of a mind, or many minds, that found it necessary to put specific marks on specific surfaces, and, in at least some cases, to do so repeatedly and consistently enough that the marks look, to trained eyes, like something that meant something. What that something was is the question. A counting system, an ownership mark, a ritual symbol, a map of something physical or something conceptual, a name, a prayer, a warning, a story. The gap between the mark and its meaning is, in the case of the Buila stones, perhaps the widest we have encountered in this entire exploration. At least at Sungir we can measure the investment in ivory beads and understand, however incompletely, that it represents belief. At least at Anghelu Ruju, the bull carving connects to a Mediterranean symbolic tradition wide enough to give it context. The Buila marks resist even that partial contextualization. They sit in their ambiguity without apology, offering themselves as evidence of something without specifying what. And perhaps that is the most honest place this exploration could arrive. Not at a solved mystery, not at a confirmed interpretation, but at a marked stone in a Romanian valley, its incisions sharp enough to see clearly and opaque enough to resist every attempt to read them. Someone made these marks. They made them carefully, on stones they selected, with tools they controlled, in patterns they repeated. They knew what they meant. And that knowledge, precise, specific, entirely real to the person who held it, did not survive. It ended with them, or with the last person they transmitted it to, and what remains is the mark without the meaning, the sign without the referent, the message without the language to receive it. What would it change about everything we think we know about when human beings first began to write, to record, to reach across time with symbols? If we could read what those stones say, the Buila stones leave us holding something that is both very small and very large, a marked stone in a Romanian valley, its meaning gone, its intention intact. The gap between those two things, between the evident purpose of the mark and the total loss of what it meant, is the gap that defines so much of what we have been moving through in this exploration. We keep arriving at the edge of meaning and finding that the bridge across it did not survive. But there is something the Buila stones share with almost everything else we have encountered. Something so fundamental that it is easy to overlook precisely because it is present everywhere. Every site in this journey, from Cueva de los Teos to the carved chambers of Anghelu Ruju, from the eye idols of Brak to the skull removals of Aşıklı Höyük, assumes a basic fact about the people involved, that they were here, that they arrived, settled, built, buried, marked, and that the landscape they inhabited was one they had reached through some path that the record, in most cases, does not preserve. The question of how the Americas were populated, how human beings first arrived on continents that had no humans at all, is one of the most contested and rapidly evolving questions in all of prehistory. And there are sites in South America that sit at the center of that debate in ways that have not yet been resolved, and that carry implications for the entire human story that we are only beginning to appreciate. We travel now to northeastern Brazil, to the state of Bahia, a vast and varied landscape that stretches from the Atlantic coast inland to the semi-arid interior of the Sertão, where the rainfall is unpredictable, the vegetation is sparse and thorny, and the limestone karst topography produces caves and rock shelters that have preserved organic material across extraordinary spans of time. It is not an easy landscape. It is hot and dry and demanding in the way that landscapes are when they offer resources only to those who understand them deeply. And it is here, in a cave whose name translates simply as Cave of the Bones, Toca dos Ossos that researchers working in the Brazilian interior found skeletal remains that have quietly become some of the most debated human fossils in the Western Hemisphere. The cave sits within the São Raimundo Nonato region of Piauí State, an area that has been the focus of intensive archaeological investigation since the 1970s, led primarily by Brazilian archaeologist Niede Guidon, whose decades of work in this region produced findings that challenged the established narrative of American prehistory repeatedly and controversially. The broader region contains sites with rock art, hearths, and lithic assemblages that Guidon and her collaborators dated to periods far earlier than the conventional model of American peopling. Findings that were received with considerable skepticism by much of the archaeological mainstream, and that remain contested. Toca dos Ossos is part of this landscape, geographically, intellectually, and controversially. The skeletal remains found in the cave are human. That much is not in dispute. What is disputed, what has generated a debate that cuts to the heart of some of the most fundamental questions in American prehistory, is when those individuals lived and died, and what their presence implies about the timing and route of the first human arrival in the Americas. The conventional model of American peopling, as it stood for much of the 20th century, proposed that the first humans entered the Americas from northeastern Asia, crossing the Bering Land Bridge that connected Siberia and Alaska during periods of lowered sea level, and spreading southward through the continent beginning approximately 13,000 years ago. The Clovis first model, named for the distinctive stone tool technology found at sites across North America and associated with the rapid spread of the earliest confirmed American populations. That model has been under sustained pressure for decades. Sites across the Americas, Monteverde in Chile, Pedra Furada in Brazil, and others, have produced evidence of human presence at dates that the Clovis first model cannot accommodate, pushing the horizon of American occupation back to 15,000, 20,000, perhaps even earlier. The debate has been heated, methodologically complex, and consequential, because if humans were in South America before the dates the conventional model allows, they must have arrived by a different route at a different time, through a chain of migration that the current evidence does not fully reconstruct. The remains from Toca dos Ossos entered this debate through radiocarbon dating that produced ages significantly older than the Clovis horizon, dates that, if accurate, would place human beings in this part of Brazil at a time when the conventional model says no humans should have been anywhere in South America. The response from the broader research community was cautious. Radiocarbon dating of old material in cave environments is subject to contamination. Organic material can absorb carbon from groundwater, from the surrounding limestone, from the percolation of younger organic matter into older deposits, in ways that can produce ages that are older or younger than the actual date of the material. The dates from Toca dos Ossos have been questioned on precisely these grounds, not dismissed, but held at arm's length, pending confirmation through methods robust enough to survive the methodological scrutiny that claims of extreme antiquity invariably attract. This is how science works at its edges, and the edges of American prehistory are genuinely contested territory, where the stakes are high and the evidence is difficult. The skepticism directed at the Toca dos Ossos dates is not dismissal. It is the appropriate response to extraordinary claims, applied consistently. But the morphology of the remains adds another layer to the discussion, one that is independent of the radiocarbon controversy, and that points toward questions that the dating debate does not exhaust. The skeletal remains from Toca dos Ossos and from other early Brazilian sites in the same region display craniofacial features that differ significantly from the features typical of Northeast Asian-derived populations, the populations from which the ancestors of most living Native Americans are believed to descend. This morphological difference was noted early and has been discussed, with varying interpretations, by researchers working on the question of American prehistory for decades. One influential interpretation, associated with Brazilian physical anthropologist Walter Neves and his collaborators, proposed that the earliest Americans, represented by skulls like the famous Luzia from the Lagoa Santa region, which shares morphological characteristics with the Toca dos Ossos material, were descended not from Northeast Asian populations, but from an earlier migration of people with affinities to sub-Saharan African and Australo-Melanesian populations. In this model, the Americas were peopled in at least two distinct waves, with the first wave bringing people whose physical characteristics resembled those of populations in Africa and Oceania rather than Northeast Asia. This hypothesis is controversial. It has supporters among researchers who find the morphological evidence compelling, and who argue that the genetic record, still incomplete for the earliest American populations, does not preclude the possibility of a diverse founding population. It has critics who argue that craniofacial morphology is an unreliable guide to population ancestry, and that the genetic evidence from living and ancient Native American populations points consistently toward a single founding population of Northeast Asian origin. The debate is not resolved. The evidence from Toca dos Ossos and the broader Lagoa Santa skeletal sample sits at the center of it. Material that, depending on how it is interpreted and what dates are accepted, either complicates the standard model significantly or represents a regional variation within a single founding population. What is beyond dispute is that people were in this cave. They died here or were brought here after death in a landscape that was already ancient when they arrived. A landscape of limestone and semi-arid vegetation and the specific demanding ecology of the Brazilian interior that required intimate knowledge to survive. Whoever they were, they knew this place. They had learned it, or been taught it, or carried with them the skills and knowledge necessary to live in it. How they got here, from where, by what route, at what date, is the question that the bones in the Cave of the Bones cannot fully answer. They are the end point of a journey whose beginning is not preserved in any record we have found. They arrived in South America at some point in deep prehistory, crossed distances and landscapes that we can barely reconstruct, and ended up eventually in a cave in Bahia. The cave kept them. The limestone preserved them. And now they wait in the collections of institutions working to understand them, for the analytical tools and the accumulation of comparative evidence that might finally make their story legible. A cave full of bones in the Brazilian interior, their owner's origins contested, their dates disputed, their journey from wherever they began to wherever they ended entirely unrecorded. They were here. That much is certain. Everything else, the when, the how, the where they came from and what they believed and what name they gave themselves, is a question the bones have not yet answered. And in a cave whose name means simply what it contains, the bones keep waiting for someone to ask the right question in the right way. The bones in the Cave of the Bones leave us with a journey whose beginning we cannot find. People arrived in South America, that is certain, and the path they took, the route they followed, the generations of movement that brought them from wherever human beings first dispersed to a limestone cave in the Brazilian interior, is a story that the physical record has not yet given us the tools to read completely. They were travelers in the deepest sense. People in motion across a world that had no maps, following knowledge that was carried in memory and experience rather than written anywhere. The contrast with what comes next could not be sharper. Because our next site is a place where people stopped moving, where a community chose a location, a very specific, very particular location, and committed to it with a completeness that left behind one of the most remarkably preserved Neolithic settlements in all of Europe. Not a cave, not a burial pit, not a tell accumulated over centuries of building and rebuilding. A lakeshore village. Wooden posts driven into the mud of a shallow lake, preserving organic material that almost never survives in archaeological contexts, giving us a window into daily Neolithic life so clear and so detailed that it feels, in moments, almost uncomfortably intimate. We travel to northeastern Spain, to the edge of Lake Banyoles in Catalonia, where the water is still and the surrounding landscape is green in a way that feels different from the arid interior of the Iberian Peninsula. Lake Banyoles is the largest natural lake in Catalonia, fed by underground springs that give it an unusual clarity and a relatively stable water level. It is a beautiful place in the quiet, functional way of landscapes that have always supported life. Water, fish, fertile soil, the mild climate of the Mediterranean interior. And at the eastern edge of this lake, partially submerged, partially buried in the lake sediments, lies a site called La Draga. La Draga is a Neolithic lakeshore settlement, a pile-dwelling village, built on wooden posts over the shallow margins of the lake, that dates to approximately 5300 to 4800 BC. It is the oldest known Neolithic lakeshore settlement in the Iberian Peninsula, and one of the earliest in the Western Mediterranean. The people who built it were among the first farming communities in this part of Europe, part of the same broad Neolithic expansion that brought agriculture from the Near East through the Mediterranean basin and into the western extremities of the continent. What makes La Draga extraordinary is preservation. The waterlogged conditions of the lakeshore environment, the anaerobic mud that prevents the bacterial decomposition that destroys organic material in dry sites, have maintained wooden posts, wooden tools, textiles, seeds, food remains, and the full material texture of daily life in a way that is almost without parallel for this period and region. Excavations conducted since 1990 by a team of Spanish and Catalan researchers have recovered material that makes La Draga not just archaeologically significant but genuinely revelatory, a place where the Neolithic is not inferred from pottery sherds and stone tools alone, but seen in the grain of worked wood, the weave of plant fiber, the seeds of cultivated plants still recognizable after 7,000 years in the mud. The wooden posts of the settlement structure are among the most striking finds. Hundreds of them driven into the lakebed to support the floors and walls of buildings raised above the water level, preserved by the mud that closed over them when the settlement was abandoned. Analysis of the wood has identified the species used: oak, poplar, willow, elm, and the techniques employed in shaping and working it. The tools used to cut and shape the wood have also been recovered. Polished stone axes whose cutting edges still show the wear patterns of actual use, hafted in wooden handles that the waterlogged conditions preserved intact. This is extraordinarily rare. Stone tools survive everywhere. The wooden handles they were mounted on almost never do. At La Draga, both exist. The agricultural evidence is equally remarkable. Emmer wheat, einkorn, barley, lentils, peas, the full suite of Near Eastern founder crops that the first farmers brought with them as they spread west and north across Europe. But also acorns, hazelnuts, wild fruits, evidence that the La Draga community supplemented its cultivated food supply with gathered wild resources in ways that suggest a flexible, mixed subsistence strategy rather than a rigid dependence on farming alone. This flexibility is consistent with what researchers increasingly understand about early Neolithic communities, that the transition to agriculture was not a sudden switch from one mode of subsistence to another, but a long, gradual process of integration in which farming and foraging coexisted for generations. The human remains found at La Draga have added dimensions to the site's interpretation that the material culture alone could not provide. Burials have been recovered from within the settlement, the familiar pattern of intramural burial that we have traced across so many sites in this exploration, and their analysis has produced findings that raise questions about the social organization of the community and its relationship to the broader world around it. Isotopic analysis of the skeletal remains has revealed that some individuals buried at La Draga were not born there. The chemical signatures in their bones, strontium and oxygen isotopes that record the geology of the water and food consumed during childhood, indicate origins in different landscapes from the one surrounding Lake Banyoles. These were people who came from elsewhere, who spent their childhoods in different places, and who ended up, for reasons that the evidence does not specify, as members of the La Draga community. In a Neolithic farming village, the presence of individuals with geographically diverse origins implies mobility, not the constant movement of hunter-gatherers, but a different kind of movement. The exchange of people between communities, through marriage, through migration, through whatever social mechanisms these early farming villages used to maintain connections across the landscape and prevent the genetic and social isolation that small, sedentary communities are otherwise vulnerable to. Who were these individuals? Were they women who had come to La Draga as part of marriage exchange networks that connected distant communities? Were they men who had moved in search of land or alliance? Were they people who had been displaced from their home communities by the kinds of violence we have seen documented at Schletz and Buila, survivors who had traveled far enough to find a new place to belong? The evidence does not specify, but their presence, the chemical signature of a distant childhood recorded permanently in bone, is a reminder that La Draga was not an island. It was a node in a network, connected to other communities, other landscapes, other lives, through ties that the archaeological record preserves only partially and at the edges. There are aspects of La Draga that researchers have found more difficult to interpret. Among the recovered material are objects that do not fit easily into the categories of tool, food, or personal ornament. Items whose purpose is not obvious, whose form suggests function, but whose function resists identification. This is not unusual for Neolithic sites, where the full range of material culture included objects whose purposes were ritual, social, or conceptual rather than purely practical. But at La Draga, where the preservation is good enough to ask more precise questions than is usually possible, the presence of unidentified objects is more pointed, because the quality of the evidence raises the expectation of answers that the interpretive frameworks do not always deliver. The settlement was abandoned sometime around 4800 BC. The reasons for that abandonment are not entirely clear. There is no evidence of the violent destruction we saw at Qatna or the catastrophic mortality of Hamin Mangha. The site appears to have been left in a relatively orderly way, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, as the community either moved on or dispersed into the surrounding landscape. The wooden posts remained. The mud closed over them. The lake kept what the community had left behind. For 7,000 years, La Draga sat beneath the water, unknown, its contents preserved in the darkness of the lakebed with a fidelity that would have seemed miraculous to the archaeologists who eventually found it. A Neolithic village, complete enough to read like a photograph, waiting in the mud for someone to come and look. What is most striking, standing back from the full picture that La Draga presents, is its ordinariness, not in the dismissive sense, but in the profound one. These were people who built houses, stored food, made tools, buried their dead beneath their floors, and maintained connections with distant communities through the movement of people across the landscape. They were doing what human beings do. They were living. And the lakebed kept their living for them. The wooden handles of their axes, the seeds of their crops, the bones of people who had traveled far to be there, in a darkness and a silence that held everything intact until we were ready to ask what it meant. What else is waiting in the waterlogged margins of ancient lakes and rivers across Europe that the mud has been keeping for us, patient and perfect, for thousands of years?